Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And quite a bit has happened since last episode. About, I believe, 9, 10 days ago. At this point, is what we're looking at. Maybe a little longer. But of course, there is more out of Ukraine, which we have quite a bit. We'll get into, especially when it comes to some of the particulars, some things that we've been touching on in the show. But we came across a couple of articles that, once again, we did want to go over on the show because we do think they reveal quite a bit. I would say much like the focus is different, but it's much like the Aristovich article in the sense that it completely broadens your perspective of the war, puts things in a whole new light, and really addresses points that have been made from us, from other people, since before the beginning of this war. At least I think so. Of
Yeah.
course,
Now it's going to be technical. I don't mean to interrupt, but the article is going to be a bit lengthy. It's going to be very technical military language about particularly artillery systems.
oh, wonderful,
Okay.
beautiful.
So, um, prepare yourself. I will try to make it entertaining, but the important thing I'm trying to do is I'm going to synthesize some of the things that I have been saying on the show for people who are listening regularly. Some of the recent things that Weeb Union has said in the last 48, 72 hours, but particularly yesterday and today. And then the Telegram channel, The Right People. Um, I guess the admin, the owner of the channel, I have no idea what his name is. He doesn't give out his name. I mean, anybody familiar with the channel understands fully why he cannot do that. Um, but he wrote what I think was a very good article. I don't know if he's military himself, but he seems quite astute. And in any case, much of what he says seems to bear out the things that we've been saying on the show for quite some time. Um, Particularly, like for example, how I think pretending that like HIMARS isn't effective is kind of like a silly cope, right? Um, Pretending that it's not a game changer. Okay, maybe it's not, but it's also not a toy either. So um, that means it has some kind of value. But anyways, do proceed.
Of course, we have plenty of updates about the Middle East. We'll be getting into Biden's remarks that he made tonight as of the date of recording. We're recording right now the night of January 29th, 2024. So we'll get into his remarks about the Middle East, the ongoing situation with Israel, as well as the expanded conflict there, the news about the base in Jordan, the sudden outcry, it seems, the renewed calls for war with Iran. Of course, we have the border crisis in the U.S., and also plenty of miscellaneous European news items to get to. East Asia, the Far East this week, pretty calm, all things considered, so I don't know if we'll get to anything there, but if we do have extra time, we'll certainly just give you a brief overview of some things that are happening or at least developing there. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to you to just let us know everything Ukraine over the past 10 days.
Okay. Yes, yes, yes. So we begin with the first photo I sent you. It's not a photo; it's just a graphic of the front line in Rabotino. Okay. So as you can see, December 5th, which was almost 2 months ago, was the largest extent of the gap, the salient that Ukraine had formed. And you can see now it no longer has that more deep bowl shape, but it's quite shallow, like a shallow soup dish. And that's, I mean, that's partly because the Russians began applying pressure in other areas, and also, for all we know, maybe munitions were a consideration. Maybe the loss of material. Ukraine did lose a lot of material in military hardware in that sector. They pressed for a very long time. I'm still of the opinion that Zelensky uh, did hold back the amount of forces that he could have sent. And, that's another topic we're going to discuss today, the potential firing of Zaluzhny and his replacement Budanov. Recall some of the articles where Zaluzhny had angered the Washington Pentagon consensus and all the talking heads and experts that he should have gone in more forcefully. I think Zaluzhny probably saw in the first 3-4 days the extent of the Russian planning for this for his attack. Think, for instance, that the Russians set up cameras over 100, 200, sometimes 300 meters in front of their trench lines. This was the most coordinated we ever saw the Russians in this war. And they used the helicopters to maximum effect. In the Zaporozhye region, in the fighting there, they only lost one helicopter. I mean, of course, they've lost more, but not there. So they have handled this area extremely well, and I think it bears out. Now you can see in the left side of this graphic an area that in purple. That's an area that the Ukrainians have retaken. That was formerly in the gray zone, and then you can see beneath it, slightly to the right, a field that the Russians have taken, and they're closing in on Rabotino. But the biggest changes, of course, aren't visible here. They have happened through all of December, and that's why, Verbove is like, it's not even in this graphic because really they've been pushed out, and that whole southern push that the Ukrainians they've been pushed back. To be fair to them, though, the Russians have had a difficult time. I don't know, like what the strategy is for Rabotino, if they think it's worth it. Remember, there's probably 14 to 18 days left before the earth starts to like really go soft in Ukraine. So there's not really very much time for a proper offensive, like maybe 3 weeks max. I don't know, depending on how this winter goes. It's a colder winter than last winter in Ukraine, but um, I don't think it's, like some of the winters that we used to have in the middle part of the last century. So anyways, that's Rabotino. There's nothing really going on in Verbove. Krinky, the Ukrainians now are just on the islands. The town itself, there's a small sector that is in the gray zone. Whether there's Ukrainians there or not, I don't know. The Russians have begun dropping fab bombs in an area on the other side of the Dnipro, east of Krinky, but on the Ukrainian-held side. That could mean that there is a accumulation of men there, and they may try something else. By March, I would say that it'll be much easier for them to make crossings again. So I would expect that. Krinky itself was basically a way to tie up Russian reserves and to destroy some of their material. And the article that I'm going to eventually read for you tonight, will examine that. So the next slide that I have up is Avdiivka. But instead of talking about Avdiivka, at first, I'm going to talk about a town. Basically, it's here on the map. Trust me. So, you see basically the part that is Avdiivka, which is this sort of round-shaped thing that's kind of surrounded. The left side, on the edge, you can see that there are two guns, two pistols, which indicates that there is fighting there. That's Prvomaiske. And then this is a close-up of it, the third shot that I sent you. which gives you a better idea of its location. Avdiivka is to the northeast of it. Okay. You can see the gains that the Russians made last week there through the tunnel. This tunnel was a kilometer long, and it went undetected. The Russians would use artillery to drown out the noise of men making their way through the tunnel, cutting holes. They had to stop at one point to create ventilation shafts. But it was a tunnel that was created during the Soviet era. And it's kind of baffling that the Ukrainians didn't know about it. But here we are. The Ukrainians did make a significant push to try to retake those lost positions,
So is
but
this
they
yet
haven't
another
worked.
Russia-Hamas connection? The tunnels.
So the fourth slide that I sent you, that's going to show you the kind of progress the Russians have been making. Oh, I would say the red outline shows you the gains that they made on Saturday. Today is Monday night. The black areas are basically gains that they've made in the past few days or weeks. This is an area that the Russians do want to control, either to go further south or to head to create a salient that would begin like a larger surrounding of Avdiivka, the region, or Donetsk city, the region, rather than the city itself. And now we'll get to Avdiivka proper. Let me bear with me, because there's a very important lesson. So this is Avdiivka. I'm sending it to you now. That's the current situation. Again, the black outlines are gains that the Russians have made in the recent days and weeks, and the purple outlines, the two of them that you see that Ukrainians have done, are gains that they've made in the, let's say, in the past few days or weeks. But there's an important top insight that Weeb Union brought up. Now, on the show, I've been saying, that the HIMARS are not a joke. It's not a toy. I've also mentioned that the Russians have a problem with like mid-distance artillery, and that the Urlan is still not as good as the HIMARS in terms of precision. Or probably you can add distance to that too. The article that I'm going to eventually read will highlight this. Now, we've said on the show many times that the frontline trenches are often for the Ukrainians are filled with conscripts who've had little or no training. And I would say that after the failure of the Zaporozhye front for the Ukrainians, they have adopted a strategy that they were already using, but now applied it for defensive measures, and that is you're going to still have the meat shields, the older guys, the less capable guys, the guys that there's no time to train, who are going to die in the trenches, and they're going to be up front. And if they begin retreating, then it will be one, it's because they have to. Two, it will also be to ambush the Russians. But those guys will be in the trenches, and it's probably you do have elites giving up, like in Avdiivka when the Russians utilized that tunnel and they captured the air defense base south of Avdiivka. They captured over 24 Ukrainian soldiers that were surprised, and it's the 110th, which is one of their elite brigades and members of the presidential brigade. But I'm just saying that that's not what happens most of the time. So these guys are going to be in the trenches, and they are what Weeb Union says is deep defense, multi-layered, trench upon trench upon trench. Every tree line has a trench. Every town has a trench system in it. There are tunnels and bunkers, and those guys fill up those areas. The other concept of the defense is the active defense. And these are guys in the rear who are very well trained, who get the better equipment. You will see them exit out of Bradley's. And even though I believe it's the M113, Vietnam era, and the Krepi, which is a Turkish version, which is slightly modernized, a little bit better. They'll get those, but often you'll see the conscripts, and they're going to be riding like on top of an old BMP or even a truck. There was a video of them getting hit, and they're all on just the back of a big flatbed truck. There isn't even any tarp over it. So these guys are the ones that are being wasted. And when they talk about Ukraine is running out of men, that's what they're talking about. Like, because their strategy is basically, now I've said this before, even weeks ago, even before we had Geo, that they fill up the holes with men that they can expend, right? But in any case, it is a strategy, although it's bloody and costly, it is a strategy that generally works. And one of the places where this has been highlighted is the Russian attempt to take Novomihailovka. So I'm going to send you this next photo, which will highlight that. Now, today, the Russians made some gains in the north. But you can see in this image the purple areas that the Ukrainians have taken back from the Russians, which are in purple, of course, and the black is the Russian, and these gains are either a few days old or a few weeks old, and the red outlined by the Russians is new. Now the thing is, every time that the Russians try to take an area and it doesn't work, and they can't get their second wave of men to come in, right? Essentially, the first wave is ambushed, and they are forced to retreat. They never have enough men to do this, or so it seems, right? And so this is where the Ukrainian active defense kicks in, and they are very well trained, very well equipped, almost all NATO, right? And they're the ones that are going to go in and ferret out the Russian troops that are there if the Russian troops don't get out in time. Okay, so it's a very costly way to fight for both sides. The other area that has been developing that I think is also very interesting. Before I go, I'll send you just one more, and actually, it's not even worth showing. It's a very tiny gain that the Russians have made today in Avdiivka, but it's too tiny. But I'll show you an area where again this occurred, and this is in the sort of Donetsk, Liman area, Lugansk border where there's been fighting. And again, you see the area where the Russians have taken all this territory, and then they've been pushed out. They go to a slightly different area. They take some more. This is from the 29th, so this is from today. These are the gains that they've made there. I believe this is like towards Liman. Anyways, this is in just north of the Kremena area with that big forest. So another example of deep defense and active defense. Ukrainians in this purple area, meat shields, poorly trained, poorly equipped, occupying the trenches. They're attacked by the Russians. The Russians gained this area. They don't supply or can't supply more men to hold on to the gains. And then the Ukrainians in active defense negate the gains, right? Now, you can see that in Avdiivka, the Russians are very focused there, and they won't allow that to happen. Or, I mean, it's happened in a few areas, but the retaking of territory by the Ukrainians there has been fairly insignificant. And there is a push, I believe, by the Ukrainians in the northern part of Avdiivka that they will try to take very soon. Now, there was also an interesting video. I'm going to show you now a picture of the east side of Avdiivka. And Weeb Union had this on his channel. And this squiggly line, remember I talked about a video that the Russians captured this area. You can see the black outlines, those are the gains that they made. Well, I said that, the armored column wasn't attacked. And why wasn't it attacked? Well, there was a longer video that popped up. And basically what you saw was they went down towards this new area that they wanted to take. And then as soon as they got to the edge, they started to go north again, as you can see with the blue squiggly line. What happened was that the Russians, they had small units that jumped off their infantry fighting vehicles. Another thing that I didn't really know, but the Russian units are mixed. Now, I've always known that the Russian military has like a mixture of Z stormtroopers that are the leftovers of the Wagner battalion or Wagner group. But I didn't know that like every unit that they have, except for some specialty brigades, are in the sort of the division model. And they have a mix of like experienced and inexperienced fighters. So, and, my suspicion to one of the reasons why Kupiansk has held on so well is because all those reserves that they sent there, they acted as the meat shields while the Ukrainians, the well-equipped, more ideologically motivated Ukrainians used active defense. Now, I have brought this up many times since this war has started, that is what they do, because it's something that they did even in 2014 and 15, right? So that hasn't changed. But the thing is the armored column was never attacked. One, it wasn't that huge, so the Ukrainians have to think, is it worth all these artillery shells? Two, it started to go back up north. And what they may or may not have detected is that Russian soldiers had already jumped off these things. And so they're making the small incremental attacks on foot. Wagner used that to take over Soledar that way by just going on the heights. The Ukrainians switched to that strategy in Zaporozhye when they started to make inroads into Robotino and south of it. And the Russians are using the same tactic again. Again, because their artillery it's still precious, even if it's expendable. So now let's move into an area that I wanted to focus on that could be like a new potential example of what I've been highlighting this evening. And this is in the it's Kupiansk, but it's south of Kupiansk. Kupiansk is northwest of this area. If you follow this road will take you toward Kupiansk, but not directly. It goes where you can't see it in the graphic, but there is a Russian front line up there that sort of swoops around. Now, as you can see, the gains that the Russians have made here are pretty significant. I'll give you a close up. They have captured a town. Next photo is coming up. And you can see the small gain that they made today. Now, the question is, are the Ukrainians going to, I can't see why they wouldn't, uh, use their active defense to push the Russians down? Because what this is doing is this grinding down the Russian military, right? They become exhausted because they're fighting the first stage, which is the deep defense, with poorly trained guys, and then very well trained guys, very well equipped guys with Bradleys that have ATGMs. They come in and they're very fast. They go in and out. They might even storm some of these places. So it's a very, very tough fighting, and they do so, I think, when the Russians are basically getting exhausted, and that is the opportune time. And this is sort of like a simplified version of what I'm talking about. The lines here represent the trench networks that are there. That would be the deep defense. The arrows are possibly the area where the Ukrainians are going to use their active defense with their well-trained units. Okay. So let's take a look at a topographical map of this area. And you can see why, for the Russians, it was very important to take it, because it's on a high ground. They had to go through a valley in order to take it. That's always a very important thing to consider in an area that is so flat as Ukraine. It's kind of crucial. And that's most of the gains. I'm trying to find maybe one more. I mean, it's not significant enough. Anyhow, I think I've got that part down. You've seen the battlefront. You've seen the small changes that have occurred. A possible salient by the Russians is developing south of Kupiansk. This last photo will show you where this area is situated. It's not a small gain. I would say so far it's pretty significant. Okay. But it remains to be seen if the Russians are able to hold on to it. Of course, the question is also, are the Russians really that invested in this area? I mean, if they have, unlimited powers, they could be invested in this and Avdiivka. But I believe that Avdiivka is more of their concern at the moment. Anyhow, so that is that's it for the maps. And now I'm going to read you the article that I think kind of synthesizes that will help synthesize what it is that I'm talking about. So bear with me; it's a bit
certainly
long. I will skip over areas that I think are maybe just too redundant, and I'll try to focus on areas that I think are very noteworthy. So remember what I said about active defense and deep defense or static defense, right? And remember, like, what it is that you're reading in the headlines, and we need more men, and so on and so on. Think back to Zaluzhny's concern, right? These are his best trained men, even though they only got 5 weeks of training for many of them. Some of them, depending on the kind of unit they were in, maybe they got 6, maybe they got 4. I don't know, but 5 was what I read over and over again. Think
certainly
how
not up to NATO standards.
Right, even though NATO's training them, right?
Exactly.
If they were in NATO, they would be in there for minimum 2-3 months. They're getting 1 month and 1 week, which is not a lot, but that's what happens when you try to, create an army on the go. Okay, so the Ukraine War Artillery Warfare Considerations by the Right People Telegram channel on the 29th of January 2024. Recently, some interesting information appeared on the various Russian veterans channels about the battery war. They stated that the shortage of ammunition and the alleged refuse of artillery support from the ministry's forces to Wagner was not such, or at least only partially, The ministry did not refuse to support the Storm Z assault detachments. It simply could not, and this was not because of ammunition, but simply because the Ukrainians would not let them. By this time, it had been more than half a year since the Ukrainians had received a huge and varied arsenal of Western artillery, SPGs, MLRS, including the HIMARS. They had completed training and were beginning to gain experience with them on the battlefield. This put the Russians, with their generally antiquated artillery, at a huge disadvantage. While in the early periods of the war, they were able to create moonscapes to lay down guns and incessantly bombard AFU positions. Now this was simply impossible. When they tried to do so, they were quickly detected and neutralized by the AFU artillery. Think back now to Prigozhin. Not a military man, he may have not disclosed the problems of the Russian military. And I guess later on we'll talk about Strelkov, but as another important story this week. But maybe he did know and did not want to articulate what this article is articulating, or maybe he was under the impression that it was all just not enough artillery. However, when they reached into the city, there was more than enough artillery. But in any case, in this situation, the Russian military had to adapt and be much more mobile, avoiding the use of the same positions for extended periods, as well as night fire unless necessary, to avoid being located by the thermal and light signature of the flash of the gun. The command structure, with lines of guns forming a battery, was broken down into individual guns. This lesson could have been learned from day one from the artillery units of the republics that operate most of the times independently. So he's talking about the war in 2014 and 15. At the level of the now independent guns, there were many changes in day-to-day operations. Instead of being in the aforementioned gun lines in the middle of the field, all guns were moved to tree lines where special care was taken to camouflage the guns according to the weather conditions. Ammunition is stored several hundred meters away or in a region of 1 kilometer. In the event that the roads are impractical due to conditions, the ammunition has to be brought in by hand. Gunners also now, under drone threat, have to pay attention to camouflage, their own thermal sight at night, and dig a lot to have a number of positions to alternate or relocate to. The crew generally lives hundreds of meters away from the weapon's replacement. As if they are spotted, they will be attacked. This posed a problem for the Russian assault troops, who were used to a huge volume of fire from both mobile guns and a number of towed guns. At this stage of the war, they simply could not unleash their potential, either through neutralization or suppression of the guns by enemy fire, or because the mitigation of the tactics and strategies adopted made impossible to deliver the previous volumes of fire. They simply could not unleash their potential and support the Storm Z units. Add to the fact that in late 2022, early 2023, when the battle for the city, he doesn't mention that, I'm sure he means Bakhmut, took place, Russia lacked precision. Yeah, Russia lacked precision systems on widespread basis. The pre-war ones had probably been worn out, and the industry had not yet made a mobile, solid transition to a war production mode. In other words, in order to cover their advances, they needed volumes of fire that the Russian army could not provide. The difference between the amount required and the amount needed was simply paid in blood. Using the Media Zone website, we can see that even today, at the end of January 2024, 20% of the total identified casualties of the war, which are 40,000, are prisoners and members of the PMCs. Obviously, this number in 2023, closer to the battle for Bakhmut, was at a higher percentage of the statistics, since the bulk of the deaths of both groups it was in the first 4 months of 2023, which is when they captured the city. We can also see how the prisoner deaths peaked in the first 2 months, while those of the PMC are more in the last 2 months of the 4 months, I think is what he means, probably reflecting the fact that once access to the city was consolidated, it was left to Wagner's highly trained soldiers to fight street to street, in which the enemy artillery could not play a significant role due to the obstacles of the environment. At the same time, the conditions of the pocket created allowed Russia to deploy its artillery, covering the approaches and entrances to the city very effectively and without having to deal with enemy artillery. The sacrifice of these men and Ukraine's stubbornness to defend the city at all costs served the MOD of Russia to recognize its army, acquire new materials and troops. Thus, we see how the anecdotal use of the Lancets begins to gain momentum precisely in the last 2 months of the battle. Of course, this evidence, that of the published videos, is partial, but it clearly speaks of an upward trend in the use of the Lancet family of drones. Here, Russia acquired its first serious and effective counter-battery weapon, and the results began to show almost immediately, as the AFU artillery could not simply sit back and fire from out of range of most of its Russian counterparts. On the other hand, the JDAMs began to make an appearance in January, replicating the Lancet trajectory of use in small numbers and then scaling up. Thus, the Russian VKS, I believe that is their behind. It's a specialty unit. These are troops that fight behind, in the rear. That doesn't mean they're, crawling through enemy-held territory. It can mean anything. It can mean just operating the Lancet, right? Thus, the Russian VKS became active again and greatly increased the ability to attack the Ukrainian rear. Thus, Russia now had precision elements at its disposal. Remember the article from 3-4 weeks ago, might have been the Washington Post or the New York Times, that talked about significant losses in the rear that the Ukrainians
Yes, it was the New
have
York
had to
Times
face.
because they
Yes, you're
talked about the black vans, and I can't remember the exact term they used, but they used very disparaging terms for the Ukrainian conscription program.
right. As well as is well known, the Battle of Bakhmut was followed almost immediately by the Ukrainian counterattack. Although we do not know the details, it is logical to think that the AFU attempted some kind of attack with a mixed doctrine of Soviet heritage and new NATO ideas and systems. That means a hybrid that uses volumes like the Russian one at the beginning of the war, but including elements of NATO based on precision, especially when it came to suppressing the Russian batteries firing on the advancing troops. Here, the Ukrainians were very successful, as evidenced by the resignation of Major General Ivan Popov, commander of the 58th Army, precisely because of the problems in the artillery war. However, this Ukrainian advantage was canceled out by other advantages available to the Russians, such as a solid network of defensive systems, infantry with ATMGs, the appearance of the FPV drones en masse, the use of helicopters to hunt armored columns, as well as the use of VKS to accurately attack the rear. The Lancets, for their part, helped reduce the Ukrainian artillery advantage. The AFU still had the lead, but Russia was closing the gap. Having surmised the year 2023, it seems appropriate now to talk about the systems. We have talked about the HIMARS. The Russian counterpart in terms of caliber and role in the military structure would be the Uragan. However, unlike the bigger Smerch, this one had not received any modernization plan. It did not have precision munitions or modern communications, control and firing systems, etc. They were slower and inaccurate and not suitable for modern warfare, as often even with proper firing solutions, they were unable to eliminate the enemy system. Either it was gone due to the time it took to aim the weapon, or they simply bombarded the area but did not affect the system.
Now, just an aside,
Remember,
because the HIMARS were brought up, I will remind everyone who may have forgotten that the HIMARS are what they use to harass traffic on the Kerch Bridge for a stretch of months in 2022. For those of you who remember that, and then remember the
Antonovsky
October,
Bridge.
the October attacks that
Yeah.
really led to the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian infrastructure. So, although of course they've been used in other places, that is, I think, really what you can think of when you think of the HIMARS, just in terms of what they were used for and their effectiveness.
Yes. And this is remember I said that the they're very careful to make sure that they don't lose the HIMARS, right? They're now they have lost some of them, but they're very careful not to lose them. All right. And I think as soon as the Americans saw how effective they were, they sent like a lot more. They tripled the amount that they initially said. Sent, which was 12, and I think it went up to like 36. Um, so I hate to criticize other people, but that make the videos. Brian Berletic saying that the Russians have the similar system and a lot more of it. Like, it's not bearing out, right? I don't think, like, how can I put it? He's a little bit more detail oriented than the guys in the Durand, but these are generalists. You know what I mean?
And it
They
also
don't.
ignores the fundamental difference, and of course, when these weapons were developed, in doctrine between the United States and the Soviet Union. Whereas the Americans, for decades, you could even say that this is still somewhat true as of the modern day. The Americans focused on precision, focused on higher quality at the expense of quantity. Whereas the Russians, while they didn't sacrifice quality altogether, they made what I guess one could call, average or serviceable systems in massive quantities. And we can see this between just this conversation right here. And the HIMARS clearly are more accurate, and they are able to more adequately harass Russian forces versus the Russian equivalent, which, while I'm
Yeah.
sure would be effective if used, well, number one, they weren't put through a modernization program, and who knows for what reason, what was the logic behind the MOD doing that. But
Yeah.
once again, you can't exactly get the equivalence there. And with the Russians fighting the kind of war that they are, where, of course, not entirely, because no military is ever entirely civilian casualty averse, but at least more civilian casualty adverse than, say, the Ukrainians are, you don't want these less accurate systems when you're conducting these kind of operations. So
Right. Right.
it's certainly not a one for one, whereas the Russians could match it, especially in quantity. They could make up for the lack of
Right.
quality, which
That's
we've
why the
seen.
Russians have
Yes,
used the Caliber missiles.
exactly.
That's why they've used like their best missiles, and that's actually something interesting as well. That the Russians, in a way, to avoid modernizing all these other systems that they have, because they're not they don't have an empire without 800, 900 outposts everywhere, and hundreds or thousands of ships and so on, and carrier upon carrier. Like, they need like they're on a defensive posture. They're like, you might take us, but it will be a Pyrrhic victory for you, and you'll lose. Like, in your victory, you will lose,
Once again, much
essentially.
of Soviet
Kind of
doctrine that
like
was
kind
defined by
of like
World War
Britain
II.
after World War II.
Yes. And much of Soviet doctrine was defined by World War II, and you see this especially in their air defenses with what happened to their air force in the opening stages of the German invasion. But once again, you see these things translated over, and of course, over the course of the Cold War, these were all taken into considerations, that being the last major industrial war, that being the most accurate thing to go on. But once again, we're in not entirely, but very uncharted territory with this current war, and we're seeing what a third generation war, what a fully mechanized war looks like in the 21st century. And like I said, the only thing even comparable in, say, the modern era, in that I mean the past few decades, is once again the Iran-Iraq war, when we're talking about long drawn-out fighting with these troops along these lines where it is very stagnant now. Like I said, I would say both sides are markedly more competent than the Iraqis and the Iranians in that war. But once again, just to paint with broad brushstrokes here.
Yeah.
But as you were, please do continue.
Yeah. So he goes on in this article, and he says the Malka, or the Peon, 203 millimeter gun, using the 30 F-44 rocket assisted type ammunition, can hit at distances of 47,500 meters. In general, this is a sufficient range to take care of a large part of NATO guns. Although these distances, the accuracy is affected, as with the max range of any non-guided munition, be it Russian or NATO. In addition to the fact that the number of 2,203 millimeter guns is lower compared to or equal superior NATO systems. We should add that being a larger and older weapon, the whole firing process is generally slower. This weapon would be in good position to engage 39 caliber guns, even with the Excalibur ammunition, but would be at a disadvantage against 52 calibers, such as the Archer and Caesar, unless they were on a fire mission aimed at the Russian rear and therefore closer to the front. Notice how the Ukrainians were complaining about the Caesars and the Krabs from the Poles being too big, and they got noticed by the Landsets. I just thought that was interesting. Anyways, the the 2S5 Hyacinth S, having 152 millimeter and a 2A37 rifled guns with increased pressure limit in the bore channel are able to fire the standard 30F59 HE without rocket assistance at a range of 30,500 meters. With the rocket-assisted munition, the Bucklan, are capable of reaching 33,000 meters. As is to be expected, systems are inferior to NATO counterparts for the most part, resulting in longer reaction times. In case of using Krasnopol M, the range does not exceed 20 kilometers, and with the use of the Krasnopol M2, we obtain a range of 26 kilometers. The 2S5M, 152 millimeter, in the early 2000s, a Russian upgraded version of the Hyacinth, with the 2S5M index and a 2A37M gun appeared, which has a slightly higher mass of 28.2 tons and a range of 37 kilometers, with a 30F60 projectile with rocket assistance. The range of the Krasnopol MY-M2 remains the same in the original complex. In addition, the 2SM5 version is equipped with the advanced automated fire control system, with more advanced means of information exchange between the gun software and the head vehicle of the battery's senior officer, which significantly reduced the time required to prepare this SPG for firing at a target. The 2S19 Mitsa, 152 millimeter gun, makes use of the 2A64 cannon, which provides operation with non-assisted shells like the 30F64 or the 30F72 at a range of 24,700 meters. The rocket-assisted 30F61 was developed to increase the range to 29,000 meters. Upgraded Mitsa S under the S2S19M2 Mitsa SM2 designation has a 152 millimeter. The modernization focused on updating the systems. It received a modern automated guidance and fire control system, greatly reducing reaction times. It should be noted that going into this war, there were only a few tanks, only the most modern tanks, and they were few in numbers because the Russians used so many T-72s and T-62s. They didn't have night vision. And one of the things that I discovered in reading some other articles was that U.S. and NATO forces always use night vision, even if they're fighting in the daytime, for getting heat signatures. At the same time, the gun received an increased rate of fire of up to 10 rounds per minute. This big but is that it retained the same 2A64 gun, and therefore the 2S192M has the same ballistic qualities as the 2S19, providing a firing range of no more than 20 kilometers with Krasnopol M, 26 kilometers with the Krasnopol M2, and the max range of 29 kilometers being achieved in the unguided rocket-assisted 30F61. The 2S43 Malva. In principle, the concept is easy. It is quick, simple, and an important improvement, but there are no spectacular goals here. The idea is to mount the 2A64 gun of the Mitsa series on a wheeled truck. The truck is also equipped with an automated guidance and fire control system, which helps with reaction times, and of course, the evacuation of the system after a fire mission is much faster than that of a towed system. It could be considered a cheap system as it introduces no new capabilities in terms of range, but it will greatly increase the survivability of the Russian towed guns as well as reduce reaction times. They will move away from using the towed 2A64S to fit them on this chassis to a big extent, Since it is a truck-wheeled platform, it is also cheaper and less resource-intensive to produce and maintain than the tracked Mitsa. The first serial production batch is reported to have been delivered at the end of October last year. To sum up, the longest ranges are provided by the 203 millimeter 30F44. In more common systems, we find a range of 37 kilometers if the 30F60 is fired from a 2A37M gun. Now, as is well known, Ukraine has received enormous amounts of military aid, in almost all fields, the largest assistance program since the Second World War. In the case of NATO, due to greater standardization, it is quite convenient to group the long artillery into two groups, the 52 and the 39 calibers, as the NATO weapons of the same calibers have similar performance characteristics. With the Russians, we have the L-47, which is a 2A64 gun of the Mitsa, and the 2A37 gun of the Hyacinth. The L56.2 on the 2A44 gun of the Peon. We should also add all Soviet systems inherited or delivered as aid, but as their range is generally similar or inferior to the Russian ones, which have more modern versions of. I will not add it in the count of the sake of simplicity. So now he has a lot of numbers here. In general, we can say that Russia until 2024 was able to deal in counter artillery duels with Soviet or Soviet line systems and with NATO systems of L-39 calibers, having big problems with L-52 calibers. Of course, this is a simplification, but it is fairly indicative. The max range of the L-39 weapons is between 30-40 kilometers. Remember when Popovsnaya was opening up, and we did that episode? This was like
Yes.
early April of 2022,
Yes.
and I was talking about how the NATO cannons had a 10-kilometer advantage. They didn't have them. They didn't have very many of them then, but they got a lot of them later. And I think that is what speaks to forcing the Russians to use the Lancet. The max range of the L-39 weapons is between, yeah, I read that part. For example, we find that the FH-90, which is an L-39 towed gun, can use rocket-assisted projectiles at a distance of up to 40,800 meters, similar to an Excalibur being fired from an L-39 of an M109. Overall, the L-39s have had a slight superiority over the current Russian 152, depending on the models, but the advantage is not overwhelming in the sense that the conditions necessary for Russian guns to defeat NATO's L-39s can often be met, depending on the particular and relative geography between the guns and ammunition that is being used. Now he brings up Krinky. Earlier in the article, I repeated that the Lancet was one of the few effective counter-battery weapons at Russia's disposal until now, and this system, to me, is worth studying in detail. As I expressed in my channel on December the 15th, one of the possible reasons for the fixation of the AFU command with Krinky is not the locality itself, since once the surprise element was lost, it was impossible to join with the AFU forces north, and therefore impossible to develop the breachhead into an operation deeper inside Russian lines. But the sense of the operation became this: to tie down Russian forces and to destroy Russian material. This in turn serves us to observe the course of the artillery warfare over the course of the operations in the area. As usual, to compare the losses, I will use on the one hand, the analysis previously done by Lost Armor and the Telegram channel Creamy Caprice. And on the other hand, I will use for the analysis of the Russian casualties source War Spotting, which is Ukrainian. My criteria for this are two things. From November the 1st to January the 16th, and two, that they're geolocated. With these two data units, with these two data per unit destroyed, the margins of accuracy are high, in stark contrast to sources with unreliable methodologies such as the famous Oryx, with a large error and leading to huge deviation in statistics and conclusions. From the Russian analysis, we have that 7 episodes were geolocated at a distance of 5 to 10 kilometers from Krinky, 14 at a distance of 10 to 15 kilometers, and 7 episodes over 15 kilometers. A total of 28 systems were confirmed destroyed. Now, I remembered this, and actually, I can send you the picture. Um, even history legends and DEMA of military analysis both mentioned this. In total, we have 51 recorded events with either destruction or damage as a result. Of these, only 13 were artillery fire. The remaining 38 were destroyed by Lancets. Of the casualties identified, only 2 were L-52s, 2 were Susanna 2Ss. Of the L-39 NATO systems destroyed, we have 7 M109s, which are an L-39 type, and 5 M777s that are also an L-39 type. The rest being Soviet line systems, the 2S1, the 2S3, and a Czech SHKH VZ-77. Interestingly, both L-52 systems were destroyed not by the Lancet but by artillery, like a laser-guided Krasnopol. This means they got close to the Russian artillery and came under fire while attempting to fire mission in the Russian rear. So favorable situations still arise for the Russians, even against such superior L-52 tier systems. I think that in general, this confirms the thesis that I have been expressing during the article about the Lancet being the most effective anti-battery weapon available to the Russians, at least in terms of its range, which allows it to be used on more occasions. And on the other hand, it is remarkable either that the resistance of the Lancet to electronic warfare or the lack of it in the AFU. On the other hand, while the Lancet is 75% of the total episodes, it is only 60% of the confirmed destructions, pointing to the known fact that cope cages and other mitigations and shielding systems are effective, as well as relatively low explosive payload of the complex. I should say recently the Lancets have increased in range, speed, and munition power. We have a discrepancy when comparing the data as the Russian team focused on the Krinky area, in particular by establishing a radius around the location. Since there is no such organization in the source for Russian losses, I will select the losses in the same period of time in the entire Kherson Oblast. I will count on within a similar radius. Okay, so 1 damaged system for the Russians, 1 destroyed inside radius 1 and 2. 6 SPGs, 6 were destroyed in radius 3, 1 outside radius 1, 1 unknown. This is the part where it's kind of spotty. MLRS, excluding TOS, as they are not artillery weapons, 3 damaged, 8 destroyed, inside radius 3, outside radius 8, 4 rear attacks. The percentage of destruction is higher. In effect, the accuracy of the HIMARS and 155 artillery of Western systems, coupled with a higher explosive charge than the Lancet, means that in the event of close arrival or impact, the chances of destruction versus damage are much higher. Compare 74% destruction versus 55% destruction by the Russians. The HIMARS remain a formidable system for accuracy attacking the rear of the battle line. Here it is worth noting that the battle line is about 60 kilometers deep. If a brigade is fighting in area X, only a small percentage of it will be in the trench. The rest of the unit is scattered in a multitude of locations, awaiting rotation to the front line or providing service and support to the combatants. Different sources say that the depth of this line is usually up to 60 kilometers, which is well within the range of the HIMARS. 3. On the other hand, the most apparent conclusion is that this is one of the first artillery battles Russia has won in a long time. There is no apparent reason for this in terms of attack systems, so there are 2 possible culprits. A, geography may have helped the Russians, as there was a water barrier that the Ukrainians had to get around. This may have been a factor for the Russians, who, for example, could have tried to avoid approaching the river line to hit enemy troop concentrations on the other side and simply bombarded the beachhead from a relatively safe distance. Only a few pieces were destroyed quite close to the front line. Um, T-62s, the tanks, for the most part. In turn, this may have forced the AFU to use large numbers of artillery units than usual in an effort to support the battered troops in the landing zone of Krinky. The only known new system that has been introduced in the area that we know of is the 1K-148 Yastreb counter battery radar. The Russians announced its commission around the 2nd of January, and the next day the Ukrainians released a video of it being damaged. It was first presented to the world in 2022 military forum. In general, it is unlikely that the system was operational on the day it was announced, and most likely it was operating for some time. It is likely that before it was damaged, the system was involved in locating many of the Ukrainian systems that were attacked. One interesting thing about this system is that it has a range of 40,000 plus meters compared to 23,000 meters of the Zu-1M radar. So I'm more than halfway through. So I think that's enough. Basically, the article goes on, and it says several things. The Russians will introduce a more effective counter battery radar system and the increase of Krasnopol D munitions, which are their best munitions. Remember that I think back in October and November, I said that the Krasnopol D munitions will increase by 30%. I'm just becoming self-aware that this is a very long article, but I think it makes the point that I began the show with, and that is that the Ukrainians did enjoy a superiority in artillery in the second half of 2022 to the first half of 2023. And maybe it was a time this summer and the Russians only began being able to equal them or better them in the winter of last year. Like, I mean, you know what I mean, like November, December. Those are my guesses, right? So,
Yes.
so that's why I say, like, when you read articles about, like, oh, the Russians dropped more shells than us, oh, this, remember last week I showed that, like, for 4 months actually Ukraine used more shells than the Russians did. And again, that's not because the Russians have more shells, which we didn't know at the time, but because they cannot stay stationary the way they did in 2022, right? That's the difference. So now we know really how this war is evolving and why it is certain things were not done that could have been done. And it's always the case that, you know, like, it's always like some small channel with a guy that's, you know, pretty intelligent, that may have military background, and, you know, he's kind of figured it out, right? And you know, we Union, I don't think he wanted to be a war analyst, you know, with maps every day, but you know, even though he was saying things I've been saying and you've been saying, he contextualized it into this model of, you know, deep defense and active defense on the part of the Ukrainians, right? So I hope people see the synthesis here, right? The Ukrainians are doing a kind of defense mode. This is why when the NATO, like the Western media and NATO announced that they're going to go into a defensive posture, it might sound like tragic and, oh my God, I can't believe it, but it's more complex than that, right? Or when they're saying they're being outgunned 5-1, they're using maybe older statistics because at the beginning of the war, I think the Russians did have the edge in artillery.
And you also have to keep in mind, with every public Ukrainian statement, there's the consideration of how can this get us more aid? How can this get us more support?
Yes, yes. So, I hope people see the tactic that was deployed here, right? You've got more accurate systems. Yes, they're very expensive, right? A HIMARS missile is often more expensive than like several times more expensive than the gun they take out. But on the other hand, what it's doing is it's not allowing the Russians to use the full force of their men, right? Like, if we were back in the first 6 months of 2022, the Russian gains would have been much higher, right? The counteroffensive, okay, they would have bared with it. But if, like, it's not so much air defense systems as highly mobile artillery systems, I believe, that the Ukrainians are using that's coming into effect here, right? Think of the huge losses that the Russians had in just taking that area north of Avdiivka, right? They got it. It's stabilized, yes, but it was costly, right? Um, they've had more success in the south, but the southern part has more trench lines, and that's where some of, not all, but that's where some of the more inferior reserves were. Although the 110th was there, which is that's that is the brigade that is responsible for defending Avdiivka, and it was the 140, it was the 47th Brigade from Rabotina that was transferred there for support. So I think people see now how it is that the Ukrainians are fighting this battle, and they are fairly effective. Now, gradually they're losing, like they're losing territory, but they're also factoring in the cost of Russia fighting this, right? Um, it's an election year for Putin. It's an election year for Biden, and it would have been an election year for Zelensky. But that might be a good segue to talk about Zelensky.
Oh yes, indeed. And what I will say about that entire article and everything we talked about, I think between the flashiness of drones, aircraft, missiles, which once again are all very pivotal weapon systems, people tend to forget that for centuries, artillery has been the determining factor in many wars. In fact, one could probably say most wars. And you want to just go back as recently as World War One, it was artillery. Most of the casualties, I correct me if I'm wrong, came from artillery.
Yeah.
And it is such a vital system to have because it is the backbone of the infantry, which is the backbone of just any armed force in general. Without the artillery, the infantry is they're sitting ducks. They're left completely alone, and especially when the enemy has superior firepower, it's a bloodbath. It's a slaughter, and I do think that given recent American wars, think Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, where they're not fighting a conventional military force, this is lost on people because we do
Yes.
airstrikes, we do drone strikes, we do raids, we have small patrols. Once again, these aren't organized armies. Like, sure, the Taliban or ISIS or whoever else may have had some mortars or something primitive, some small rocket system, say what I don't know, Hamas or Hezbollah might have had 15 years ago, just for a rough example. Not that the
Hmm.
U.S. has directly fought Hamas or Hezbollah in that time, no, indirectly certainly, but what we're looking at is, especially from the Western perspective, especially from NATO's perspective, and even from Russians' perspective, since you look at the wars that they fought in the lead up to this, that was Syria, and you want to go back further, that was Chechnya, that was Georgia, where they weren't fighting really conventional force, especially in the case of Syria and especially in the case of Chechnya, where they were once again conducting operations much like the U.S., where it is strikes, it is raids, it is fighting against these irregular forces. And I do think that until this happened, and maybe for those who paid keen attention, the war in the Donbass from 2014, before the 2022 invasion, did show the utility of artillery in those sort of situations. But it wasn't really until Russia and Ukraine went directly head to head that people realized the absolute vitality it had in military operations. Like I said, it might not be the most flashy systems. They might not be the most flashy systems. They might not be the most impressive, the most expensive. Sure, they may lobby for tanks. They may lobby for F-16s. Which once again are all vital for war effort, especially if you want to do combined arms. But what we're looking at here, the most vital support Ukraine has gotten is artillery and munitions because that is what allows you to not only hold a front line but also advance, conduct offensives, counteroffensives. And none of what I'm saying here is any sort of groundbreaking thing. This has just been conventional wisdom, uh, militarily speaking, for once again centuries at this point. Even millennia. You want to go back before gunpowder, the trebuchet, the catapult. And once again, these siege weapons, if you will,
Yeah.
have made
We should
all the
also
difference.
remember
But
Ukraine
yes,
has
go on.
500 military satellites at its disposal, over 130 private satellites that also help it with its military, right? They have over 600 satellites. It's not really this like the media portrays them as just these plucky guys. They're not, you know, the NATO generals routinely go to Ukraine.
It has been
They've
a pet
had,
project of theirs since 2014. They knew that this war was coming. That's what
yeah,
Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 were about, on both sides, kicking the can down the road, preparing for this war. And now, although you could say it's been inadequate, although you can criticize the training that's been going on during this war, which certainly warrants criticism, NATO has been preparing these forces for war since 2014, and we are seeing the results of that. Sure, it's a hybrid between NATO and Soviet military doctrine on the Ukrainian side, but I mean, look at how many NATO officers have been allegedly KIA in Ukraine. And look at the command centers that we have there. Look at the amount of American
yeah,
and European and Canadian military advisors that have been in this country. As you said,
yeah,
this is a NATO war with Ukrainian bodies. That the only thing the
yeah,
Ukrainians are doing is being the can fodder. They're servicing the ground troops. Otherwise, command structure, everything. Sure, Zelensky isn't irrelevant. Zelensky isn't irrelevant by any means, but this war is being fought for all intents and purposes from the Pentagon, and I think that's an open secret. Everyone knows it.
yes, yes, and also, Stoltenberg was interviewed. I forget whether it was NBC or I don't know, ABC or CNN News. It was one of the big um, television channels, and they're not even really talking about winning. They're just he mentioned that well, this is good for American industry, and it's Ukrainians dying, not Americans. Like you heard Millie say that, you've heard Lindsey Graham say that.
Everyone's favorite
Um,
Nikki Haley said it as well.
yes, yes. So, um, but I'm seeing more and more articles about Ukraine running out of men, and that is because um, they don't have an air force, not really, and they don't have Russia's deep strike abilities. Like we've talked here at length about medium range, but long range is another story, and that's an area where Russia dominates, where they can take out barracks, right? Um, Not that the Ukrainians haven't done that; um, they pale in comparison to the amount of times that the Russians have done that. But
And NATO has been holding back the long range because they know the implications of that, and apparently, given their decision, they're not ready to escalate the war to that point. And that has
not
been
no, not yet.
and
And Germany voted against sending the Taurus missiles, which I assume are on par with the French Scalp missiles. The French sent the Scalps, but the Russians have been able to knock down most of the Scalps. So, I mean, I think the focus on Crimea is like Krinky, right? The Ukrainians want to focus on Crimea, not just because it's a PR thing, but because it depletes the effectiveness on the front line for the Russians.
although they of course have moved the administrative command center away from Crimea, as you know that they struck the Russian Black Sea Fleet HQ a few months ago. And not to mention that is where probably the most powerful fleet in the Russian Navy is. Once again, the Black Sea Fleet is still stationed there. They're still conducting operations. We've seen them harassed by drones. We've seen them harassed by Ukrainian fire. There's actually been land-based anti-ship missiles, and a lot of speculation that the British, the Royal Navy, have been coordinating Ukrainian war efforts against the Black Sea Fleet as well. So it is also about breaking that vital institution in the Russian military, with the, and because in large part, not entirely, of course, in large part, this is a war for hegemony over the Black Sea. I mean, you look at the situation right now. You have Bulgaria, you have Romania, you have Turkey, which have it hemmed in on the south. And of course, had they gotten Ukraine, had they gotten their naval base in Sevastopol, Russia would be completely pinned in the Black Sea. But at this point, they can still project power into it. At this point, they can still project force into it, as we're seeing actively right now. But once again, I would say about half the Black Sea is still solidly NATO territory. And I don't know if Russia's going to be able to go all the way to Odessa, if they even intend to go all the way to Odessa to cut Ukraine off completely from its shoreline. But even if they are, ceasefire tomorrow, agreement signed, formalization of the annexed territories, the land corridor that the Russians took, and with the coastline that has along the Black Sea, that's still a major improvement over just Crimea and just what they had before, and also the Black Sea regions of Russia that go up in the southern Russia border, Georgia, that area right there. But it when it comes to getting back to the point of long range strike capability of the Ukrainians, clearly NATO is not ready for that yet, because I do think that they know it would incur a an unprecedented Russian response if they were to give them that sort of strike capability. And the more NATO provides for this war, the deeper entrenched they are. I think it goes without saying, the higher the risk of a direct confrontation between NATO forces and Russia. And I'd say the only reason that hasn't happened yet is frankly because NATO does not want it to happen. There's plenty of incidents that they could have ran with. There's incidents with the missiles falling over the Polish border. There's the alleged violations of Romanian airspace. There was the
Yeah.
possibility that the Baltic states could have blocked off the corridor to Kaliningrad. There are so many possibilities that they could have used in order to escalate this war, but clearly NATO does not want to. And I do think it's because they realize that even when it comes to the Americans, force readiness is not there. I'm going to talk about recruitment numbers later, particularly the stories coming out of Britain, and also some of my thoughts on the current state of the U.S. military, particularly with the border crisis. And like I said, we'll get to all of that later in the show. But clearly, this war has not escalated because both sides, but I would say NATO especially, realize that they do not have the manpower and the resources to commit to the next phase of war.
Right. And now with the potential of definitely another war in the Middle East, they don't want, they can't. They simply can't.
No, no.
Um,
And once again, it comes back to
Essentially,
that
the
bargain
Americans,
of what are they going to do about East Asia? Because that really seems like without mobilizing reserves and without resorting to any sort of draft or conscription, it would have to be a massive divestment from East Asia, a massive rerouting of forces. That's touching on the point I made last episode.
I can only think of the kind of false flag that they'll need to bring back conscription. I really, and they're capable of it because now they're really in a bind, and it would be kind of like an army on the go unless they have. You brought up Britain. We have Boris Johnson, Lance. Is he Lance Colonel?
Lance Corporal Johnson,
Lance
following General
Corporal.
Sanders and not Colonel Sanders.
Yeah, yeah. Um, he's there trying to get conscription. There's all these. I saw one conscription video. Well, it's meant to encourage conscription, right? Recruitment, rather. And that is you see these 4 or 5 British soldiers in a very barren, wild, elemental kind of landscape with mountains, no trees, almost like a subarctic setting. And one of them takes off his helmet, drinks some water from a creek, and then begins praying, facing towards Mecca. Like this is such a Western wet dream. Honestly, they like it. This is a tactic that they could have used at the end of the Soviet era, where they had a lot of the Muslim countries on their side, but that's not it
Oh,
anymore.
just imagine
Um,
you have the British soldiers praying to Mecca, the Russian Chechen detachment see them and join them. Isn't that the ultimate propaganda video that the West could create? Look, our diverse coalition is even drawing in our enemy. That's how tolerant and inclusive and kind we are. But yeah, so much for base Britain using Muslim troops. Yeah, right. But I mean, I will. I suppose since we've broached the topic, I'll touch on some of the stuff with Iran and Israel and later down the road here.
yeah.
But the British, this actually comes after a quite humorous story of them putting a job offer out on LinkedIn and other job posting websites seeking, I think it was a rear admiral for the Royal Navy.
Yes, I remember this.
And I guess in many ways that is a return to tradition, hiring mercenary captains to lead your forces. That is very medieval of the British. Now, unfortunately, it seems to be the only thing these days. Now, I don't know, maybe living conditions, maybe standard of living might be there in a few years. We'll see how the current
Well,
energy crisis takes us,
they're
but
in talks with Ukraine. Ukraine has requested frigates from the British Navy that have been decommissioned, and Britain has said we could possibly do this because we don't have enough manpower. They're not being used anyways because they don't have enough sailors to begin with. I could not believe it when I read that.
I think I made this point a few years back, and this was even before the current recruitment crisis got to the point it was. I believe this was 2019, that you have to realize for the first time in literal centuries, the French actually have a larger navy than the British. Now, I
Yeah,
know both have been relegated to mere shadows of their former selves, their former empires, so it's not much to go on. But I do think in the grand historical picture, that is a very a very telling fact of the entire situation that you can actually gain a lot from. Because I mean, at this point, there's really only three countries in NATO capable. Okay, maybe four. Four countries in NATO capable of fighting a war on any scale, and even this is stretching it. You have the U.S., you have France, you have Turkey, and you have Poland. Those are the only countries I think
yeah.
that could probably maintain a war effort of any realistic scale. Now, how long they could do that, that's another question. But I mean, even the British, even the Germans at this point, completely dilapidated, completely hollowed out militaries. We're talking 4 out of 30 countries that could even get close to being able to wage anything that anyone would even consider a war that isn't just a policing operation, that isn't an anti-terrorist raid, any of these sort of things. But getting back to the British number, so the solution for this crisis is conscription, which brings up a number of interesting questions about the demography of the UK, both in terms of number of immigrants and the status of native-born British. And I'm sure it won't shock you, up until the past couple decades, the prime core of the people who joined the British military were from places like Northern England and rural Scotland. Once again, very much mirroring what you see in particularly the US, other Anglosphere countries, where it's these people from these conservative and rural, more rugged areas. That's the kind of people who are attracted by the idea of any sort of military service. And I can't speak for the British, but I imagine it's much the same, where it is a generational tradition in many families. The idea that, well, I just come from a family of soldiers, so that's what I'm going to do. And I mean, you even look at cases like in the U.S. Not to get on too much of a side, where there are people who are part of this family saying to their kids, to their grandchildren, that look, it's not what it used to be. It's in complete shambles. Don't waste your time with it. And I can imagine if we're going to extrapolate that situation to the British, which might be maybe not entirely one for one, we also have that as well. So you don't have the traditional stock of the military that you want to join. But let's look at the other options. What? Indians, Sikhs, Pakistanis, Caribbean immigrants who came in the 1950s, their descendants, second, third generation immigrants to the UK. These are people who, by and large, you look at the opinion polling. Of course, speaking generally, but you look at the opinion polling. an overwhelming majority of these people view the British as a racist country. The reason they're there is because they feel that the British owe them for supposed exploitation in the colonial era. And this is nothing new. You hear this sort of rhetoric all the time. And no real affinity for anything British, even in a civic sense. And these aren't the people who you're going to convince to take up arms for this country without some sort of massive benefit. But once again, these people already get massive benefits for doing next to nothing. So convincing them to take up arms for this project, frankly, it's more realistic to convince American immigrants to do it because you could actually make the case for a diversity rainbow empire. Because they've fully embraced it. But the British as a country have a country with some semblance of tradition. You're not going to be able to get this. And you even look through what the British military considers disqualifying. They talk about harboring extremist views or tattoos of extremist symbols, and you go back to that. It's basic British nationalism, basic British patriotism. What do you expect from people who are willing to pick up a gun and commit to years of fighting a potential war on behalf of their nation? So they shouldn't be shocked by this, but they've reached a dire crisis where we still have to exclude the population that we are trying to drive to the fringe of society, that we're trying to drive to the margins of societies, that we are trying to disempower, while at the same time convincing them to be our cannon fodder. But because the military is an organization that is very influential, we don't want to give them too much influence within it because then it could go wrong. You see this happen in Germany all the time where they have routine purges of soldiers who are quote unquote too far to the right and they get arrested. There was that alleged coup plot that wasn't really a coup plot. I believe that was a year and a half ago in Germany. But this plays out across Western militaries time and time again. And then you can only take what you see on the internet, what you see on social media, so far, because a lot of it's grain of salt. People speak in hyperbole, people joke around, but you have these people from India originally, these people with families from India, from the Caribbean, from the non-European world, just to put it broadly, in the UK saying, well, if they try to draft me, I'm just going to go back to India, I'm just going to go back to Pakistan, I'm just going to go back to Nigeria. And there it is. Now, perhaps one could think that that is the ace in the hole, perhaps that is why we should do it, because it would give some sort of re-empowerment to the white men of society, so to speak, and convince these groups to emigrate, convince them to go back to where they or the families came from. And I do think that is a trap that they're trying to set up. I think that is more so in the U.S. case. I'll get into the situation with the border and the National Guard in Texas and all of that because I have some thoughts on that that I do want to bounce off of you and the audience, of course. But it's not going to work out that way because everyone, when it comes to the British recruiting crisis, is in a no situation. There is no positive outcome for anyone here. And I don't know how a country can continue to operate under these circumstances. Not that I think the British need to go commit to a war with Russia. In fact, I think that would probably be a disaster larger than their, let's just say, ill-advised military commitments to Poland in 1939. But in the just in terms of having the military as a national institution, it's simply not there. This is simply a country that has decayed to the point where it can't even raise a proper standard army. Now, you could say perhaps their obligations are too much, but in terms of global British military presence, I really can't think of, aside from a handful, any sort of major British global commitments that, even if they were to go full isolations, that they could cut back on. I still don't think that would solve the numbers that they're looking for. And this, like I said, the British are probably the most pronounced case in the Western world, but they're far from the only case. I know that the French have actually successfully brought back conscription, semi-successfully, I should say. It isn't a stringent conscription program that one might think of. Of course, not that you could really consider it part of the West, but it is part of NATO. Turkey has a robust conscript army. A few of the smaller nations, I think, for example, Poland might. I know some of the Eastern European states have still retained some marginal conscriptions. The Norwegians do. So it's not impossible, but even we're talking demographically, while the situation aren't the best in many of those countries, they're still far favorable to the British case, certainly. The Finns also are another case of a successful conscription. Once again, these aren't exactly like they're training them into full-time soldiers. These are effectively reservists. These are people who can be mobilized if a war is to break out. And that's probably the best the British can actually ask for at this point. But even that is a bit of a stretch. And I do think that in many ways, unless there is some sort of right-wing nationalist takeover that happens overnight, the British military for the foreseeable future is a defunct institution. They are not capable of fighting a war. You even had, what was his name, Ben Wallace, now believe however much of him you will, saying that the British only have ammunition if they for 5 days if they were to actually get into a conflict with, say, a major power like Russia. And I don't know, maybe they'll somehow convince the Commonwealth countries to send their white boys to fight in the British Army because once again, Commonwealth countries, their men are eligible for enlistment in the British military just as any British citizen would. So maybe that's the ace up their sleeve. I don't know, but if that's their last hope, it's a pretty flimsy one.
Yeah. Um, I was talking to a coworker this week who's her boyfriend's brother is in the army, and because we were joking about all these ads. Now it's not just Britain, of course, right? You're hearing this messaging coming from Denmark, lots from Britain. One of the newest ones is Sweden. Imminent war, in the next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 2030 for sure, right? Now, it could be that what the U.S. is doing right now is that they're studying this war and they're going to work on um, systems that they think effectively would beat Russia, and that could be part of it. But of course, the way it's packaged is to create a panic, right? Because obviously America right now is extended and it needs Europe to fund and support Ukraine. Um, I know I said a few weeks ago that the 300 billion in frozen assets, right? Um, there is right now what's happening is those assets are generating money, and that money is used to funnel into Ukraine. Um, well, to a degree, they've opened up funds for it, so you can buy funds based on these frozen. I don't know how they're frozen and creating profits, and you're supposed to buy one of these bonds. And in any case, the EU has two of the 300 billion. There's still a lot of opposition, especially in the US, for them doing this, but it would be catastrophic if the EU did it as well. But who knows? They may not have a choice. And anyway, so just briefly go back to the story I was talking about. I said, what are they going to do? I mean, she's Central American. Um, he said, obviously, I said, obviously, they want white boys to die. Like they need them to fight for Israel. And she goes, I don't know. I don't think a lot of them do want to die for Israel. And she said, nobody wants to die for Israel, not even brown people or black people. Her boyfriend is black. And she said they don't even want to die for this country, let alone Israel. And I thought that was quite salient.
Oh, absolutely. And even among people who are not aware of these issues, they either implicitly or explicitly understand that exact sentiment that the new Americans, the new British, the new Germans, whatever you want to call them, across the country, so called new, are not going to take up the banner. They're not going to buy into even the civic patriotism of these nations, where they're expected to fight and die for them. And it the narrative they've been sold is completely different. They exist in a parallel society. I don't think that's controversial to say at all, at least in these circles. And they're not going to fight for those interests. You're more likely to recruit them in the military for some sort of domestic anti quote unquote terror operation that targets all of their political opponents, which I don't once again don't think that's a really a revolutionary thing to say, but I think it just stands to reason given what we've seen with the narrative fed to these people, with the opinion polling you see from these people, and then you also run into the problem where the same system feeding the narrative to all these quote unquote new Westerners, I guess we can call them just for shorthand. It's not appealing to the native Westerners. That's not appealing to the actual Americans, the actual British, the actual Germans, so on and so forth. Where I guess, like I said, the only successful case I've seen thus far of anything like this, and I mean I'd have to look at the demographics of the French military, but I know the French are strange about demographics where they won't record any racial or ethnic data because of some constitutional stipulation they've had for the past 2.5 centuries since the French Revolution. So I would need to see what they have in terms of that, but there's really no viable model for this. This isn't exactly the Ottoman Empire where we can just take the firstborn sons and raise them into a janissary corps. Not that I think we should by any means, but the infrastructure's not there for it. The culture is not there for it, and whether this be genuine short-sightedness or whether there was some greater idea that just didn't come to fruition behind this is the situation they find themselves in. And the Russians, sure, you can talk about whatever problems they may have, whatever. Not saying those don't happen, but it's not relevant to this conversation. They're able to mobilize the Chechens to fight for them. They're able to mobilize these various ethnic groups, the Tatars. These names of some of these Central Asian groups escape me, but once again, they have entire detachments of these forces, whether they be regional, whether they be in the proper Russian military, and even when it comes to the native Russian population, they're able to draw them into combat. So that problem has not applied there. As far as I know, and now the Chinese haven't engaged in any major military operation in decades, but with the Chinese military, via conscription and volunteers, they are able to maintain force projection. They are able to maintain what they need for their mission. Even South Korea, which has had its share of demographic crises and cultural crises, has managed to maintain a sizable force that could respond to any, say, threats from the north if that were to arise. And as I'd mentioned before, you want a NATO example. Probably the most detached NATO example you can give, but Turkey. And I don't know if Poland has conscription, but I know Poland has been able to maintain a battle-ready military. So, but once again, these are nations, while they may be in the Western orbit, while they may be vassals of the American Empire, are allowed to be less liberal for a myriad of reasons, and even at the cost of some influence there, such as Turkey, which we see a country that is very eager to play both sides of any given conflict. But I'm focusing on the British so much to just go back to that point because I do think they are the most stark example of this, and that they really do exemplify this. And honestly, I know you'd mentioned them before, but I have to say, time and time again, every time I see a story out of the UK, whether it be this, whether it be anything else, it reminds me of how we collectively in the just broader right wing felt about Sweden in 2015, 2016, where just the lowest of the low, the epitome of where these ideas lead, and the just spitting image of Western ruin. And once again, no offense to any British listening to this, but and frankly, I think many of them would probably agree with that assessment. But in terms of race to the bottom, whether it be this issue, whether it be other issues, I just don't see a winning play for the UK. And I suppose you could apply that to the broader West, Europe especially, and that's not even getting into the myriad of problems with America. That's because certainly that we could go on about that all day. But out of all of these countries in this bind, I still see the UK is in the most impossible situation.
I would say the other country that's in a total bind right now is Germany. Um, Germany is potentially a powder keg. Um, they're trying to ban the second most popular political party, the AfD. Every region of former Germany, the first party is the AfD.
I'll be the only
And
viable actual right wing party on the continent after we've seen the rhetoric coming from Le Pen,
yes,
after we've seen the betrayals in Italy,
or
so on and so
Maloney.
forth.
Maloney,
Yeah,
oh my
yeah.
God. They literally, like, the regime literally packaged this little, like this little neo-fascist, they had photos of her doing the Roman salute. And then, she comes in and she says, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm going to bring in millions of Africans."
I mean, this is the legacy of the Gladio program. This is what all these people ended up doing. Cold War's over.
Yeah, absolutely.
No need for the dyed in the wool anti-communist sentiments. Sure, your grandfather might have been one of Mussolini's guys. Your grandfather might have fought for Horthy in Hungary or whatever other group. Now it's time to serve American liberalism, and now it's time to import Africans. It's time to import Indians. We'll let you shake your fist at the Russians every once in a while, but don't go too far with it. And yeah, you can have your offensive symbols. Just keep them in the Donbass. Don't bring them home.
Mm.
And in fact, it's actually the Russians who are responsible for sending these migrant ships into your shores. Just ignore all the American Western-backed NGOs who are behind this. Certainly ignore any Israeli or Jewish involvement. That doesn't exist at all. But this is the Gladio leftovers. This is, I suppose, at this point.
That's a great point, by the
Uh,
way, that it's a Gladio leftover. I
yeah,
like that.
yeah. Sure, you can. Well, it's much like the Azov guys. You can be as rhetorically right wing as you want, but when it comes down to it, when at the end of the day, so long as you sign the right document, so long as you take the right action, all that rhetoric means nothing, and you can have fun with it, so long as you kiss the ring at the end of the day. That's really all they ask, and that's why they have worked with these groups time and time again. Not that they've had any sort of ideological sympathy, not that they had any sort of political sympathies. It's just that they know at the end of the day they own these people, and if they refuse to cooperate, they have the legal measures, they have the extra legal measures to dispose of them in short time. Or best case scenario is they do cooperate, and that's why once again I think Maloney is probably a key example of what the Gladio refuse produces. Maybe
Mhm.
not so much the case of. I think Le Pen is just an impotent heiress to a what was once a respectable political dynasty of her fathers. And there's even some members of her family now. We haven't seen them close to power who actually do show a bit more promise on that end. But like I said, whether they're all compromised or not, that remains to be seen. But we know for certain she is. And then the AfD, one of the actual competent right wing parties in Europe that actually seems to be accomplishing something, they're on the verge of being banned, as you said. They actually do well electorally.
Mhm.
They're trying to negotiate a solution to the current immigration crisis in Germany, and that was met with fierce oppositions. And then, of course, you have the right wing in Eastern Europe, which it could be summarized by what the polls do, where uh, you can ban gay marriage for the time being. We're going to push on you later. Don't worry. Just keep your bayonets pointed at the Russians while we stab you in the back.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised. Germany's. I mean, I don't claim to watch German television, or I'm always up to politics in Germany, but in the West, they do such a good job, in America especially. They do such a good job of getting you to hate the various outgrowths of the regime more than the regime. And they're blatant about it. Think of, like, that idiot Tommy Robinson, like any of the people that I hate Islam. But like they'll tell you on and on about how much they hate the regime, and then like there's a terrorist attack, and I hate Islam. It's
Islam is
like
horrible, but I'm gonna wish the Sikhs a happy whatever holiday they celebrate.
right. That's one angle. The other is they're kind of here because of like what the regime did. So it's very frustrating. These people don't really hate the regime. Like they don't hate the regime the way we hate the regime.
They
And
it's almost
that's really the trick to avoid containment is
exactly.
not hating its products more than the thing itself.
Exactly, and they get caught up, and I do think it requires a certain faith in the institution itself. The idea that, oh well,
Yeah, yeah.
it's just temporarily in the wrong hands, not that it's just rotten to the core. Which I mean, like I said, you can talk about all day. Maybe it was salvageable at one point, but I think we are well past that point if it ever
Yeah,
was.
it's done.
Yeah, it's
It's
done.
it's really done.
Now I don't purport to have any major solutions. I have ideas, I have thoughts on it. I'm willing to explore, but once again, I do think that it does require a certain divestment, both in terms of real action, in terms of how much you participate in the system, and also
Hmm.
an emotional divestment. Realize that, look, even if your ancestors had some great connection to this is frankly not what it was. This isn't what it was even 40 years ago, if you want to go back that recently. And
Yeah, but I was just sorry. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
no, no, go on. I'm sure you have more to say
I
than
was
I
just
do.
going to say we should probably get to the IL-76 crash and
Ah, yes,
Strelkov.
yes. We'll get to that. We'll pivot back to the U.S. and then we'll close out with the Middle East. But
Okay.
the this was last week. I believe this was last Thursday. Correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong. Where the Russians and the Ukrainians had negotiated yet another prisoner exchange on an IL-76 big transport plane. If for those who are unfamiliar, and as it was flying, it was still in Russian airspace at the time. It was shot down by the Ukrainians, full of how many? What was it, like 60 some?
65
Yes,
Ukrainians. Yeah,
65
65
Ukrainians
Ukrainians.
plus a dozen or so of the
9.
Russian crew. Um,
Yeah, four crew, something 4 or 5 crew members and 3 guards.
yes,
So about 8 or 9 Russians and 65 Ukrainian POWs, 12 of which at least were Azov fighters from Mariupol. But some of them were not. I just saw some of the videos that were released today of them speaking to their family, just like literally a day or hours before they die. It's so sad.
and what little of this actually got coverage in Ukraine through alternative channels. And I know that the Ukrainians actually, I think they cracked down on a number of Telegram channels, just in the days following this. No surprise, but they were reporting that among the grassroots level in Ukraine, there was actually a lot of outrage towards Zelensky
There
and towards the
was.
government because they knew full well what the play was there. They knew that yes, this was a prisoner exchange. The Russians were flying to this prisoner exchange, and the aircraft was down. Now the Ukrainian excuse was, uh, it pivoted between we didn't know there were POWs, Ukrainian POWs on board. We just knew that there was a Russian officer that we needed to take out for some reason, and then it
I,
pivoted
I
to
love it. It's worth killing
yes,
65
yes, yeah.
prison.
That's what it pivoted to. Like, oh yeah, we knew the POWs were there, but that was a sacrifice we were willing to make in order to take out
They
whatever.
literally were making that sacrifice. They
Yes,
really did think it
yes,
was worth it.
and in terms of what that accomplished with the Ukrainian war effort, I couldn't tell you. And once again,
Yeah.
it's not like this was full of conscripts from Kharkov or Poltava or any of these areas that they write off. As you said, they had Azov guys on board with this. They were
Yeah.
completely willing to throw that away, squander any goodwill that clearly still exists between the Ukrainians and the Russians because a prisoner exchange was even taking place in the first place. And any sort of coverage from this, like I said, in Ukraine has been suppressed. Western media didn't even touch it. They didn't even say the Russians are bombing themselves like they do sometimes. That didn't
Hmm.
didn't touch it at all.
it
And
should be remembered that January the 3rd was the last the previous exchange of prisoners between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and it was the same aircraft flying the same route. So there was nothing unusual about this for the Ukrainians. They'd already communicated that like they knew full well what they were doing, so they thought like, oh well, we'll take out an IL-76, we win. I mean, Russia does sell a lot of these aircraft. I believe they made 900 in the last couple of years, but only 140 are in Russia. The rest are sold globally.
yes, and I mean it's pretty standard for what you think of as a military transport cargo plane. It's nothing state of the art by any means, but it's a serviceable aircraft, and they they just blew it out of the sky. And
Yep.
this is the treatment that the Ukrainian forces who have fought this war for a number of years, some of them if you go back to the Donbass war. And I I mean, okay, so when we see some situations with this, while it's still what you'd expect from Kiev, there is a rhyme or reason to it. Like their harsh treatment of the Donbass, like they're showing the Donbass. Sure, it's terrible. I don't think anyone here would condone it, but there is a logic to why Zelensky, to why Kiev have committed to such an action. And I'm still left racking my brain on this case as to what was the motive, because they didn't even try to pin it on the Russians. They completely suppressed it. I don't believe it was an accident because they outright said it that, oh, we thought there was a Russian officer on board. And I don't know, maybe you want to take the Ukrainians at face value, but I'm questioning what Russian
That came
official.
later.
Yeah, that did come later, but I am still questioning what was the real motivation for this. Beyond
Mhm.
I genuinely don't know.
I know, if people, I don't know if people recall, but back in the late spring, might have been early summer of 2022, Mariupol had been taken by the Russians. Over 2,500 Ukrainian soldiers surrendered, many of them Azov, many of them their elite Marine troops. And so some months later, they were, there were going to be not, I don't know, but not court deliberations, but investigations and testimonies were going to be given by Azov. Now, it should be mentioned that there was about 2 weeks ago an Azov fighter from Mariupol that has been sentenced to life for killing a family. Um, so remember that the Ukrainians killed at least 49 of them by blowing up the barracks with the HIMARS. So, just think about that. So I don't know. I mean, nobody was going to give any testimony. These 12 Azov guys, obviously, they've gone through interrogation. They're returning. Plus, you have the like middle-aged guys that look literally as old as me, that were on this plane. These are not stormtroopers. These are like these are the poor souls who are in the deep defense, right? And just as I explained at the beginning of the show, they're expendable. That's what they're running out of. I mean, they're running out of some elite troops, but these are the guys that they need to fill up the trenches. It's pathetic. But for what'll happen is nothing. They'll say, well, yeah, we did it. Yeah, we killed them. We're kind of sorry, I guess. Um, but it wouldn't have happened if Russia didn't invade. Like literally, Ukraine would never do anything bad unless Russia invades. Like Russia is literally the reason that it gives them license to do all kinds of crazy shit. But the thing is I think it was Zelensky's birthday the day after, and people in Ukraine filmed themselves like lighting paper planes that they had made and lighting them on fire as a protest to, like, basically what his idiot military decided to do. I'm at a loss for words. I don't know either. I don't know. Like, I mean, yeah, now Russia has 139 instead of 140 of these planes, but honestly, they're not that difficult to make. They can always make one of the customers wait a little longer while they take one to replace it. The crew, yeah, 4 or 5 guys, that are well trained. That is valuable for sure. But
But
I
once
guess
again, when
like
Russia committed to these,
65 guys, like 4 or 5, cargo plane pilots and navigators are obviously worth far more than 65 Ukrainian soldiers, including Azov guys.
oh, of
I
course,
guess that's what
but
you're saying.
I mean, not that I'm expecting logic from the Ukrainians, but clearly the Russians anticipated this kind of loss was well within the realm of possibility when they committed to military action. And I don't think anyone would say otherwise if they're being completely honest about the situation. But that
Mm.
does seem to be the Ukrainian calculus that if we can take out one Russian cargo plane with a crew that probably took, I don't know, a good few years to train up to standard, was that really worth it? Are there not dozens of men waiting in the wings, no pun intended, to replace them? And are we going to pretend like Russia doesn't have a functional aerospace industry, which they do. They do. And this has actually
Hmm.
been a topic even when it comes to commercial aviation, that the Russians have actually managed to make their unlicensed copies of, I think it was one of the Airbus aircrafts, which is a French company, and
Yeah, A something,
uh,
Airbus
it,
something,
it was, I think, the A380, which is the big one.
something like that. Or
But
480.
point being is, they didn't expect the Russians to continue to be able to compete in commercial aviation. But much like every other industry that Russia has managed to maintain, is all they did was cut out the Western branding, and because the supply chains were local, the supplies were local. What they couldn't get, they can get from elsewhere in the world, whether that be from China, whether that be from India. China and India being
Hmm.
the big ones, and myriad of other countries as well. So that's another industry in which the Russians have managed to maintain pace and have been able to keep everything online functioning properly. So, especially when it comes to one of their domestic aircraft models, this this is a drop in the bucket. Not to downplay the loss of human life here, but in terms of war effort, this is a drop in the bucket compared to what they had. And this was just a move of I think the most petty resentment I've ever seen from the Ukrainian side, going all the way back to 2014. And that is a
Right.
long list. That is a high bar to cross.
Interestingly, about 4 days before this happened, they bombed Donetsk and they killed 28 people. Today they bombed again, and I believe they killed three, or one was killed, three injured, or like a much smaller amount. Let's say three, but they killed 28 in Donetsk. So, you know, I mean, every time they have like, because if you look at it in light of the gains that the Russians made in Avdiivka, like they kind of throw a temper tantrum. When that happens, they feel obligated to bomb civilians, and in this case, like, well, we're going to take out these four pilot navigators out, and yeah, it's going to cost us 65 prisoners of war. I guarantee you, some of those Azov guys would have gone right back to fighting. You know, but yeah, I guess it doesn't matter. It's just horrific.
Complete impotence from the Ukrainian forces. And I think the only other nation I've seen this kind of impotence from is Israel, plain and simple.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I don't think that's coincidence by any means, but it is just,
It's like when the Israelis killed those three is the IDF killed those three Israelis.
yeah, just
They literally killed the third guy half naked, ran behind a car with a white flag, and they still killed him. He's speaking to them in Hebrew, and they still killed him. Like,
completely just
yeah,
impotence. That's
yeah.
all.
In,
That's
in
all I
a
can
sense,
say.
Ukraine did their Hannibal option. their
Yeah,
what is it? Not Hannibal option, Hannibal protocol, whatever the Israelis call it.
Yeah, that's what it
Except
seems
they
to
were
be.
getting them back. Like I guess they just really have to. They really want to hold on to the Russian prisoners.
I don't know. Perhaps that's the price they pay for daring to get captured and not just swallowing a cyanide pill upon being surrounded. Is that the logic here? But I don't even think that
Yeah.
Zelensky or the Ukrainian High Command is that hardcore. Clearly not. I mean,
It-
look, maybe a few Azov guys out there who would take that view, but what power do they pull? Those are the guys heading into the meat grinder, just as the other ones did, and the ones who frankly feel that way, just given the course of this war, have probably already done that.
yeah. I mean, if we're talking about the dozen or so, I mean, Putin actually claimed it was more than a dozen. If we're talking about the Azov guys, right? And that's the only time that upper command, even the president, uh, actually ordered them to surrender, right? Because they were going to be wiped out. And so they surrendered. That's a little different than a guy who's 45 and surrenders, who's been wasting away in a trench, seeing his buddies killed, and says, "I can't do this anymore." Um, I mean, it on the one hand, it sends out a message, of course, that they don't care about human life in Ukraine, and the public is now aware of it. On the other hand, the other message that I think they count on being stronger and um, imbibed more deeply is that there's no point in surrendering. We'll kill you anyways. Don't surrender.
Yeah, and I do think that is probably the major takeaway from this. And in terms of how much that story was allowed to get out into the Ukrainian public and to what it does to morale and what it does to the current conscription
It's
crisis
terror.
in
It's all
Ukraine. Oh,
psychological
absolutely.
warfare. It's terror. It's totally terror. It reminds me so much of America is just in Israel.
Yeah, I think you can't really put it any better than that. And I mean, I wonder if this will all end with the Hungarians following through on their threat to take Transcarpathia. Who knows? But in terms of
Mm.
how much longer can a terror regime last? How long can it last under those circumstances? And what is Zelensky? Of course, we have no way of knowing. It's not like there's any polling in Ukraine. But what is Zelensky's popularity rating? How much support does he have left among the last of the population? But I mean, you also have to remember he was just rabble rousing, talking about that we need to also liberate the historically Ukrainian territories of
Yeah.
Belgorod and
Yeah.
what was the
Kursk,
yeah, Kursk.
Rostov-on-Don, Taganrog.
Yeah, but I know Belgorod stuck out because they completely bastarded but that
Yeah,
sound that the Ukrainians love
instead
so
of the
much.
guy.
But that that was it missed once again. Further Ukrainian losses. We need to talk about taking these territories that were allegedly historically Ukrainian, based on census data that just tracked the fact that there were in I believe it was 1896 some what at the time were considered Ukrainian speakers, not a majority, just the fact that Ukrainian speakers had a community there in general to create this false ethnography, the idea that, Taras Banderachuk is living in Volgograd and has been there since time immemorium.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
once again this is the kind of ethnography that as Aristovich said, that 20% of the population of Ukraine believes is just fact.
Yeah. Yeah. My favorite is ancient Ukrainians got black Africans, sub-Saharan Africans to dig and dig and dig some more until they created the Black Sea.
Real.
Yeah. I've literally seen two separate videos, both time women claiming this, so it's hilarious. Um, but I suppose we should talk about briefly about Strelkov
Oh, of course.
because he was, and also what's her name? The woman that killed Tar,
Yeah,
Tartarsky.
the woman that they nailed on the terrorism charges.
Yes, the longest sentence ever.
Yes, and that was only
Is
27 years.
only 27 years. She's 26, I believe. she can apply for parole uh, after she serves 2/3 of her sentence, which will be 18 years from now.
I mean, I don't know the optics of using the death penalty on a 26-year-old woman, but I mean, I think it fits the crime.
It fits the crime, but the Russians are very old-fashioned this way. They never give women the same kind of sentences that they give the men. They're never as long. There is no life sentence for a woman in Russia, no matter what her crime is. Um, so yeah, so she's gotten as much as she could, if I'm not mistaken. I saw one person say she could have gotten 28 years, but um, I heard someone else say that a Russian say that it is actually 27. So I'm going to go by that. Yeah, so it's good. It's good seeing her get locked up. Um, of course, I saw some Russian shitlibs feeling sorry for her. Like, why? She showed no remorse. If you saw any of the clips of the sentencing, and there never was any remorse, right? She at first denied it. Then I didn't know it was. She knew all along. And she fooled everybody, and it took her over a year to fool everybody. So, yeah, that's good. She's going to be well past her prime when she gets out.
Fate worse than death.
But we should all. Strelkov, of course, has also been sentenced to 4 years in jail. Now he's eligible for parole after 1 year, and on some level, this is definitely a miscarriage of justice. Um, you could argue against him and say he was, a very effective black pillar in a time he shouldn't have been.
Oh, absolutely.
Um,
But I do
but
think
he
it's
was a
it's complete disservice to the man who is the
yeah,
reason that the Russians weren't ethnically cleansed from the Donbass, and I don't think that's an exaggeration to put it that way.
yeah,
And
yeah. I mean, he made mistakes. He made mistakes then. He made mistakes now. I think he lacks tact. He got into that argument with Prigozhin, but curiously, Prigozhin was somebody else that, before he died, before the so-called March of Justice, he was criticizing Russia and praising Ukraine. Um, to be fair to Strelkov, he never went to that level, and Strelkov was right about many of his criticisms, and he wasn't the only one who said mobilization should have occurred much sooner. I always said that. There was always like this fear of the Russian public, how will they react? Um, it, you know, but the fact of the matter is, you see how difficult it is for the Russians right now after receiving NATO weaponry and digging more trenches. You see, like all that land that they lost. I remember actually talking to my brother about this. I said, "You have no. It's going to be so much harder to recapture all that land that they lost. You have no idea. It's going to take thousands upon thousands of lives just to recapture that. And if they had mobilized sooner, if they had gone in with a heavier hand at the beginning, they wouldn't be in the spot that they're in now. That was a terrible miscalculation. And I think it also has to be said now that we've learned a little bit about mid-range artillery and counter-artillery and counter-artillery radar tonight. Like, um, obviously, this was a blind spot that the Russians didn't develop. Um, yes, I mean, in many ways, that the Ukrainians were going to get all that material anyways, whether the Russians destroyed as many of the systems that they did, and they did many, because they had the advantage in artillery, long or mid, at the beginning. But um, I think that the key criticism that he had was mobilization, that it should have happened much sooner, and it should have. They would have stabilized a lot more of the front line that they have now. Um, I don't know about a city like Kherson, with the HIMARS. That's a different story. Trying to protect that city without having Mykolaiv. The thing is even if you capture Mykolaiv, um, the Antonovsky Bridge is still very difficult to protect. Any of those dams are very difficult to protect. But who knows? You know, if there was another 180 to 300,000 men that were ready to be deployed in September, a lot of those Kherson and Kharkov counteroffensive by the Ukrainians might not have happened. And you have to think about like cities like Kupiansk and Liman and Krasny Liman, where those Haiti teachers, they're all dead. They're all dead. I mean, some of them are not, but some of them are in prisons. I don't know. I just think it was a horrible thing. And as people who listen to this show a lot know that five different um, Russian Telegram channels um, banned me, including anti-NATO something something and Slaviangrad and a few others. And there's some I can't even leave comments on ever. And that includes Levy, Joaquin Flores.
Oh
So,
yeah, and I mean,
so maybe if Strelkov had more tact, if he had phrased things differently, but he does come off as a curmudgeon, and some of his criticism is kind of like Russian doomerism. I have a Russian friend that's like this. Russia's always pathetic. It's never going to work out. Like it's always this doomsday kind of thinking. They have the statistics and the experience to back it up, but I think they leave some things out as well. And sometimes, them and myself will look at the same situation and we'll look at it very differently, even though it's the same situation. So I don't know. What's your take on Strelkov?
I it's so needless. I don't know what it accomplished. There were
Yeah.
now I understand wartime and his pessimistic take on the situation, especially with how influential a figure he was. Something did admittedly have to be done for the sake of Russian morale, but I do think there were easier ways to get him to shut up than
Yeah.
sentencing him to 4 years. Even with parole after 1 year, there's so many things that they could have done just to, I don't know whether they pay him off or whatever it may have been. And I don't know how quickly the media cycle moves in Russia, in the Russian media, or how much the story is going to get coverage. But I do think that once again it does a disservice to what this man has put in, and I had said it before, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he is responsible for the fact that Donbass has been reintegrated into Russia as it is now. And like I said, you can talk about what happened in 2014, 2015 with the response to the Maidan. You can talk about what may have went wrong there. But point being is, the nation of Russia, in my assessment at least, looking at this from the outside, owes this man a great debt, and this beyond any moral consideration, optically this seems horrible,
Yeah,
and
it does.
I
Yeah.
I don't know how they're going to spin it. If they will need to spin it, how much attention has been given to Strelkov over the past, I don't know, year, since that's when he really started to go quiet around last year. But I just hope that he's able to get paroled soon. I hope that this doesn't cause too much of too much discontent within Russian media and Russian society, especially this close to the election. And I don't know, perhaps that's the reason they did that because they didn't want such a vocal critic, a vocal pessimist speaking out that close to the election. But sentencing
Like
him,
like I would say, because I read some of his stuff, he was like every single thing was almost every single post was pessimistic. everything was a criticism. I unfollowed him. I couldn't do it. And like not everything was that bad. I mean, we've been critical. Um,
Oh, I know people who
I
would
just don't
just
know if
take
I
his
just don't
word at
know if
complete face value,
it's a habit of
but
his or if it was a strategy that he, because he had these political ambitions, and I mean those are gone now. Like,
oh, of course. Yeah, I don't know what his aim was with that, whether it was genuine, whether there was some sort of greater maneuver behind that. But once again, it looks really bad. I don't think that it will have, both fortunately and fortunately, I don't think it'll have much of a reverberating effect within Russian society. But like I said, this man is being done dirty, and I hope, I don't know, maybe post election, maybe after Putin secures his next term, there'll be some sort of leniency shown to his
yeah, maybe
sentencing.
some amnesty.
Uh,
I
but
mean, one of the things he did was he totally encouraged like the Ukrainians. Like, I mean, Prigozhin at the end was kind of doing the same thing. He gave them this morale boost, because I think his criticism was lopsided. It was sound criticism, but it was always sound criticism to say just Russia sucks. It's going to lose this. There's a there's a I think there's a way. I think even Prigozhin was better at navigating this than him. And I'm not picking sides. Obviously, when they raided Prigozhin's place, they found like hundreds of thousands of American bills, cocaine, icons, very eclectic life, this guy. But for all
everything you
intents and
expect from Russian
purposes,
high society.
but for all intents and purposes, Strelkov is an Orthodox Christian, and that's always going to sting. I don't know. It's just, I think you said it best when you said that there could have been a better way to deal with this. We'll never know what was ever said between the authorities and him, how reluctant he was, how they spoke to. We'll never know all those details. Did it take place? How often? Who was negotiating? We'll never know. But or we might know much later. But there must have been like another way to reach this guy and say, look, you're having a bad effect. You're giving ammo to the other side. And that was the criticism I received from the admins that eventually blocked me. But it's not like I was always doing that.
Yes, and it, like you said, there's not really much justification beyond the fact that he was overly pessimistic, and I don't know what the end result of it is. I'm not saying this is a great fear of mine, but my biggest fear out of everything is that this does have some sort of destabilizing political effect moving
Yeah.
into the Russian elections, and that this is something that some sort of opposition or just, let's say, destabilizing force tries to capitalize on, even though he was vocally very much in support of the war, while at the same time very critical of the way it was being conducted. But that still gives any sort of instability, it makes way for more instability of even less desirable kind. So that's my biggest fear resulting from this. Is now I don't think that he'll be encouraging some sort of movement behind bars or anything like that. Don't get me wrong,
No.
but I do fear that it is going to put a. Now, I don't think it's going to cost him the office or anything, but I do think it's going to put a ding in Putin's popularity and legitimacy if this does have the ripple effects that it very well could.
You know what? It's going to depend on whether he gets parole after his first year. If it's prolonged, um, then it's bad. It looks bad, and that we'll have to look at it when that happens next year, next January, and we don't know what the battlefield will be like then. But speaking of upcoming elections, there is some Jewish guy who's running for president of Russia. His platform is Stop the SMO Now. The other, of course, is LGBTQ rights.
Well, the
What
two
a
planks.
what a surprise! I forget his name. He has an unusual um, last name,
It's some
Nadezha or
gobbledygook
something.
last name.
I know Nadezha in my language.
Yeah.
I think it's in Russian as well. It's Serbian. It means to wish.
Hey, at least it's not Shabashevitz. Yeah. Uh, the FSB was right, at least in that case. It. Sorry, we shouldn't reference too much pre-show talk. It just makes zero sense
Yeah,
out of
yeah.
context. But
I don't think half
uh,
the audience will get it.
no. But I mean, just mind you, a Russian Jewish guy named Shabashevitz. That's a joke in and of itself. But moving away from that, because I think we've exhausted anything
Hmm.
else we could say. Just to touch on the final leg of this, touching on some U.S. going to Middle Eastern news. I'll start with the U.S. news because I think it'll serve as a good pivot point for what we're going to say about the Middle East. Is the current dispute between Texas, a number of Republican states backing Texas, and the federal government. So, as part of the ongoing immigration crisis in the United States, to the credit of the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, and the administration in Texas, they, outside of the whims of the federal government, constructed border fortifications to curtail border crossings, and that include barbed wire and building fortifications along the Rio Grande River. And it came to the Supreme Court. It was challenged in court. 5-4 decision that Texas is mandated to dismantle these border crossing fortifications. Texas refuses. Then you have a trickle of states start to either voice support or even send their own detachments of their state National Guard down the border, because the Texas National Guard was in charge of setting up these fortifications. Then Biden gets in, issues a 24-hour deadline that expires, nothing happens, and we're stuck at the stalemate standoff where about Texas plus 25 other states, every Republican governor except what's his name in Vermont, which shouldn't shock any of you, has issued a message of support to Texas, if not outright material aid and guardsmen sent to patrol the border in conjunction with the Texas National Guard. And the federal government has been complaining, they've been threatening funding, they've been trying to pull out everything they can in order to shut down this defiance of the federal government. And I believe there was actually a similar case during the Obama administration with a dispute between the federal government and Arizona over border patrols. But I mean, at that point, it was a far more stable political situation. Arizona eventually did balk on that, and they did back down. But for the time being, Texas has not backed down. But there are a few things we can take away from this, and that is in terms of a legitimacy crisis for this. I mean, this is on top of everything else that's going on, the continued failed airstrikes against the Houthis, the failure to really bring any sort of resolution to the situation with Israel and Palestine, the increasing tensions with Iran, and that's also on top of the failing war effort in Ukraine, as we had covered before. But you have the White House in an election year sitting here with states in open defiance, left with a few options here. So, option number one is they can take action. They can mandate that Texas dismantle these fortifications, that everyone sends their guardsmen home, and that the border status quo returns. And they can even use the force of federal agents and possibly the proper military if necessary. I don't think it would go that far, at least yet, but that is an option. Option number two is they sit back and they let this play out, and they cut some slack to Texas in order to patrol the border, take care of the border crisis without Biden and the White House having to sully their image with it. It's just something that the crazy Republicans down in Texas are doing. It's passing off the responsibility, laundering, because at this point, even you have a lot of Democrats admitting that, well, yeah, we still want massive amounts of immigration to get this wrong, but even this is too much for us. Similar to what Germany ran into in the 2019, 2020, where there was a bit of a stop on immigration. They're willing to turn down the intensity every once in a while. This might be one of the times they're doing this. But the federal government can either look overbearing and overextended, or it can look weak and impotent. And the question is, which is a worse look? And getting into an idea that I had that I'm not going to say I fully endorse this idea or I fully agree with it, but something I do think is worth taking into consideration. So let's say this goes off, and that in this struggle between Texas and the federal government eventually throws its hands up and lets the states do what it wants with the border and provides some at least temporary relief to the massive amounts of crossings. That's going to be a very, and while it will be a good thing, while it will have positive effects, at least to a degree, it's going to be a reaffirmation of faith, at least in some part of the regime, for a significant part of the population, including a lot of people who agree with us. Where, look, they are still capable of enforcing the border, and especially with Trump heading in. Okay, I'm sorry. You just sent me this on Telegram, so I need to. Um, uh, I just need to share with the audience because this can't be kept alone. So yeah, I'll just show this as soon as
It's hilarious.
OBS cooperates. I knew you were silent for a reason. I know that Emil Kazman says it about Romanians, but I think it might apply just to the Balkans in general. If they're quiet, they're up to something. Uh,
That's
but
right.
this is courtesy of GSP in the Telegram chat. But with that context with that context right there, if Texas is allowed to fortify its border, and especially if this does set off a chain of events that leads to Trump returning to the White House, that is a reaffirmation for right wingers who were already on the fence thinking that America might be done for, this entire thing might be screwed. That's going to renew their faith, and a lot of the institutions think that, hey, maybe there's still a fighting chance left. And what I do think is a possibility, what they might want to do is they're trying to drive up enlistments to, if not the proper military, the National Guard. Because, while you may think the National Guard is
Yeah.
just under the jurisdiction of the states, keep in mind that these are part of the forces that can be mobilized. And they've been mobilized many times before, and they will be mobilized again. They are the first line for that. And what we could see is this is a ploy in order to get men, if not into the proper military, at least into a reservist force, so that when the big one happens, you have these men who are now legally bound to take up arms on behalf of the United States, whether that be in a war with Iran, a war with Russia, a war with China, etc. When these are men who signed up because they wanted to secure the border, and rightfully so. Once again, very noble intentions there, but after that point, they're in the system, and the system has probably also gotten to them in many ways, where they, even beyond just legal obligation, they might actually start to believe in some of it and believe in some of the things that they're being fed. Now, how you can combine this with the so-called putting the woke away, I still think that has yet to materialize, at least in any real sense. But I do fear that, in many ways, especially if they do let Trump come back to power, because if Trump wins, there's going to be some concession, whether it be through they let him take power or they don't try anything to remove him from office post-election, where they will have, if not made some sort of backdoor deal with Trump, have at least some sort of common understanding that he's there to accomplish a certain goal. Not to get, once again, too deep in the weeds with this, but I think it goes without saying, if Trump is allowed to turn to power, then there is, while it may seem like the better alternative, and while I would certainly take over Biden, there probably is a some sort of machinations behind the scenes that we don't know the exact details of, but the idea that there's a common understanding between Trump and the people who let him take power. And if you combine that with, let's just say, a successful crackdown on the situation on the border, at least temporarily, using state National Guards, then, like I said, that might be their last ditch effort in order to draw the young white guy back into the system and to reinvigorate them to get the middle aged and then even going into the boomers who had become disaffected with the system to have that reinvigoration of Americanism that had faded. So, like I said, I'm not saying for certain that this is going to happen or that this is even the move that they're trying to make, but I do think that this is a distinct possibility that we have to explore. And while, yes, we can say that what is happening in Texas on the surface is objectively a good thing, just know that if it is allowed to happen, if even if they don't succeed, they will try to slip something in the back door. They always do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good take. I didn't think about how, the whole protecting the borders. I mean, you spoke about containment and putting the woke away, things that like America will have to do temporarily just to survive. I don't know. I don't know if, I mean, I see some steps, but I see a division and I see like a third party afraid of that division. In the same way that people are afraid of, let's say, the overextension of American forces across the globe. You know, I'll just I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I don't think that the case that they're putting the woke away is. I don't think it's very strong right now.
I've yet to see it.
Well, I mean, I've seen the first few steps, yeah, but I don't
But
I don't see
in
much
any real
beyond that.
sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would agree with that. And I actually, as you told me when we were talking about this off air, that if the feds do come down on Texas, that's game over for any sort of white recruitment, any sort of white patriotism that would lead somebody into the military. It's just it that bridge has been burned, which puts the White House in a further bind because there's no situation in which they come out on top of this. And for
Hmm.
those of you who are accelerationists, I think this is probably one of the best things that could happen because it is a no-win situation for the administration. It's a no-win situation for the American regime, and they have to concede on one thing or another, and it's not going to be pretty whichever way they pick. And like I said, while I will take the victories that we can, and while I will accept the positive change that we can, I'm always going to be aware of these things. The fact that, like I said, these always have a back door. Even if it doesn't start out with one, they always weasel their way into one, and that's something we have to watch out for. It's something that can be prevented. I don't know, possibly if we have the right people in the right positions, but I'm not holding my breath on that one.
Hmm.
But I suppose that leads into when it comes to
Yeah.
the position of the American military, this odd case in the tri nation area of Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. I know that you were expounding upon this a little bit if you want to take it from here.
Yeah. Let me find the map. I do have it here. Sorry, folks. Bear with me. I know I saved it. This will give you a good indication where it is, where it's situated, because it is an area where Jordan, Iraq, and Syria all meet,
It
and
is this no man land
it's a
that they've been operating
it
out of
is a
for
no man's
years.
land. It's a complex of bases. It's not just one base, and they're all so closely situated together, right on the border. Um, Apologies.
But mind you, this is an area we've been operating out of, like I said, 4 decades. And when it comes to this, and there are competing claims. We'll get into this in more detail once we actually give you a visual to work with here.
Yeah,
Whether
I'm gonna
it
check my
crossed
photo files.
into Jordanian
Here it
territory,
is.
whether it was within Iraq. That's also not counting the strikes that have taken place somewhere like Syria. Okay, so you have that right there. I'll go ahead and get that up right here just to give people a visual of where we're working. I think most people probably know what we're talking about, but just to really hammer the point home.
This will contextualize it.
Yes. So here's that right
It,
there.
it, it this is Syria as it stands now. Ignore the circle. That's not where it is. It's a map. It's a map for a different event. In fact, it's where you see the green area on the bottom, let's say right side of Syria. That's where you see the,
Yes, for those of you who
you
remember
know,
the meticulous Syria days, I'm sure this map looks very familiar. And that pocket of green opposition forces that has not been touched in what, let's say at this point, 13, 14 years?
well, since 2014
Yeah, at least.
or sorry, 2015.
Yeah, and that's
So
been.
I mean, it's long. It's 9 years.
Well, I didn't check the
Because the
Syria map
Americans
in a
are
while.
there to make sure nobody hurts this.
Oh, of course, and not to mention that we'll get into the speculations about the American presence in Syria, and whether that's really coming to an end or not, as part of this. But as you were saying,
Yeah. So now you know where it is, and there was a discrepancy, right? So Western media said that this was the Tanf base, right? And but I think maybe what they meant, if they're saying it's in Jordan, it's actually Tower 22. And you can see how close all these bases are.
I swear these
UN
names are
clinic
schizophrenic
closed.
bait. Tower 22.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of like 9/11. Um, so yes, it's now three service people were killed, uh, and they're all black. Interestingly enough, um,
Mind you, the vast majority of combat arms in the United States, the people who actually see any sort of intense missions are, I think, at least 80% white.
yeah, yes, yes. So yes, it is 80%. Um, I mean, basically, Political had an article late in the afternoon that I saw, and Biden tonight is, I don't know, he's supposed to address the nation and say that he's going to go in. Now, all I've heard so far today was that, at the right time, I mean, Biden did say this, at the right time, and the time of her choosing, we will retaliate, and that these will be successive waves of attacks. They do not exclude Iranian naval ports, right? But I did see a very interesting article, a counter argument, right? That someone raised. Three servicemen are expendable, especially if they're defending Israel. Um, if it was a Bradley, that's pretty bad, but it's, the one thing, and we've seen from the attacks that Iran has done, that they're extremely precise. They have subsonic, sonic, and hypersonic missiles. We know now they can reach over 1,200 kilometers. Right, this is an enormous distance. That Al Sham base that they destroyed in Idlib, or the part of Idlib that is controlled by former Al Qaeda. They took out some of their senior people there with one of these missiles. If those missiles were aimed at the F-22s and F-35s, planes that fly 3 missions and they need a new coat of paint to keep them, invisible on radar, so to speak. If they
That's
damaged
toxic to the
those,
pilots, by the way, and there's been a myriad of health issues with F-35 pilots already.
yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Um, so if they do that, and let's say they're able to destroy like 20, right? That's a significant amount. They take a long time to make, right? because it's so complex and engineered, and some would argue even over-engineered. Um, I don't know. It could get very interesting. It could get very interesting. So it, I don't know what they're going to do, to be honest. Um,
And mind you, even with Trump having John Bolton in his ear for the better part of 2 years, there were no strikes on the core territory of Iran. Now, they almost authorized strikes after the surveillance drone was shot down in Iran, but Trump called them off last minute because he claimed that he had some sort of backdoor agreement worked out with the Iranians, even though I do think it was really that he feared the retaliation capabilities. And I do think that since Biden's come into office, we are seeing those retaliation capabilities in full force. We are seeing what the Iranians are actually capable of when it comes to striking U.S. assets in the region and when it comes to the damage that they can do to other American proxies. And there, especially going back to the Houthis, there's been talks of quote unquote deterrence strikes. Now, whether or not you think that this American campaign against the Iranians on a grand scale is justified, I certainly don't. You do have to wonder, just from a purely strategic standpoint, at what points does deterrence have to become action? At what point does it have to become something greater? At what point does it have to escalate? Because we've been doing deterrence strikes for a number of years now against Iranian-backed groups,
mhm.
and I mean, we even assassinated Soleimani. Was that supposed to be deterrence? Was that an outright hostile act? Once again, how is the Pentagon defining this? And I don't think we'll ever get a solid answer towards that. But this is a nation that understands the consequence of war with Iran. At this point, the Pentagon, even the White House, even in all of their poor decisions, they understand what the consequences would be for this nation if the situation with Iran were to spiral out of control. They know that they cannot put boots on the ground in the nation of Iran. They can do it in other places in the Middle East. They can strike other places in the Middle East. But they know that fighting an actual ground war with the Iranians is simply not feasible given American military capabilities. That would require either, and in order to do it, would require either a mass mobilization of reservist forces, getting back to what I was saying with the National Guardsmen, or bringing back a draft, which is, I said
Mhm.
it. I said it with the situation in Russia. The American public would have more stomach for launching a tactical nuke than they would for bringing back the draft. 100%. Absolutely. Now,
Yeah.
do I think they're going to lob a Minuteman at Tehran tomorrow? No, no, I don't think so. But point being is, if they were put in a situation where they had to respond to a sizable Iranian military aggression beyond the scale of what we've seen before, like, for example, a direct attacks on maybe, for example, they hit Incirlik, just to just pick a major base in the region. And I'm not saying Incirlik, maybe one of the ones in the Gulf states and Qatar, whatever. I think the American public, once again, would have an easier time coming to terms with nuking Tehran than they would with drafting American men from the ages of 18 to 26.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, everyone is talking about this, right? Because first you had Germany talking about preparing a civilian army. This week they're talking about building bunkers. So civilians are responsible for building their own bunkers. Like, how much of this is hype? And they're just basically trying to scare the public. Because, if the expectation is that we're going to have an all out war in 5 years, and this is what you better do to prepare, and this is why the money has to go here instead of there, right? Um, then, if it doesn't happen, they won't be forgiven, but they'll be forgotten. So I think that's the logic that they're going with.
I would agree. And getting into further into the story, this is also around the time of the rumors that the Pentagon is authorizing American withdrawals from Syria. Now, if you actually look at the map of Syria we have right now, this yellow and orange area right here is where the U.S. have occupied in conjunction with the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, which are predominantly Kurdish. And that has been, especially in this yellow area right here in eastern Syria, where the oil fields have been, and where a lot of the Syrian wheat has been as well. And that's not even to mention the amount of gold that they've smuggled out of this country since 2015 at least. And Syria has been suffering under the U.S. sanctions, particularly because they have been withholding these resources. Not that America invades these countries to, I mean, I suppose the gold is a different case, but it's not like America's invading these countries in resource wars. You could question the moral uh, correctness of that, but at least it would accomplish some goal. What we're doing right now is we're deliberately occupying this land in order to deprive it of the Syrians. Now, I'm sure it gets sent to the Israelis, it gets sent to the Kurds, it gets sent to all these different back channels in various places in the world, but the primary objective of occupying Syria, because we failed at direct military action against Assad, we failed at using proxy groups to overthrow him, is a long war in the country, is to starve out the country and deprive them of fuel. And so far, the Syrians have managed to weather this via aid from Russia and Iran. But if they are really withdrawing, clearly the infrastructure of the Kurdish militias of the so-called SDF, that's going to implode. The Americans have not prepared a proper proxy force in order to take their place. I don't know, maybe they cut some backdoor deal with Turkey, which I severely doubt, but I will say that that is technically a possibility. I don't think so though, just to reiterate. But
Mhm.
once that happens, the SDF is either crushed or they come to the table with the Assad government like they were in 2019, 2020, and normalization begins, and the Syrians have access to their oil and to their wheat again, which effectively defeats the sanction regimes when combined with aid from Russia and Iran and China, as well as other nations as well. And that's also on top of the normalization of relations between Syria and the Gulf states that is ongoing. The UAE actually reopened their embassy for the first time since the beginning of the Civil War this week as well. UAE is one of the wealthiest countries in the region, so that's also Gulf state capital potentially flowing into Syria. We have the detente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so you could imagine that as well. Syria is being more or less accepted back into the Arab League, back into the Arab world, and not to mention, while the situation is tense, the Turkish border is not what it once was. It certainly was what it was in 2015, 2016. Now, there are the ongoing operations of the Kurdish territory, but at the end of the day, compared to the amount of oil that the Turks were trading to and from ISIS, that completely different situation. It's not even a fraction of what it once was. And conceding on Syria while preparing for a larger regional war, I I don't because I don't doubt that they're trying to provoke either a direct or indirect conflict with the Iranians right now. That is the next move that they want to make. And with that, control over Syria, starving out Syria, which is one of the not only key Iranian but key Russian allies in the region, it does seem counterintuitive, which speaks either to their desperation or a complete change in strategy that none of us are really aware of. And I would probably have to go with desperation that they just need those bodies, they need that manpower to the point where they're letting the sanctions on Syria, well, not the sanctions, but the blockade on Syrian resources be effectively lifted. And I, that's a major optics defeat for the United States. It's a major morale defeat considering the fact we had spent over a decade, 13 years, and coming up on the 13th anniversary in a few months here, trying to do to Syria what we did to Iraq and Libya. And this could be the end of Syria if, depending on how the cards play. I know that has been said many times, including on this program, but the fact that we're looking at a serious U.S. withdrawal, something not even Trump was able to accomplish, is uh, is monumental, and it breathes a whole new relevance in Syria that has not been there in a number of
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. So they've acknowledged that they had plans to leave Iraq, but they've denied that for Syria. Um, Syria is still at war. Three civilians were killed today in Israeli attacks. They did manage to shoot down most of the missiles, but obviously it didn't work. Now, about 4 or 5 days earlier, Syria was able to knock down all of the missiles, or most of the missiles, and no one was hurt. Russia has started flying planes around the Golan Heights, uh, basically as a warning to Israel. I mean, the Houthis haven't stopped. They hit both an American and a British vessel. That vessel was on fire for 24 hours.
I do
Another
have to
ship,
say, I still haven't figured out why the Americans don't have free healthcare.
yeah, yeah. um, a Maersk-owned ship was also attacked. Like, I hope people understand that there's like at least 2 or 3 successful attacks by the Houthis every day. I can't keep track of them. I'm going by the ones that to me stand out. The reason I bring up the Maersk, for instance, is Maersk said it wasn't going to send any more ships in the Red Sea. This was being accompanied by uh, an American warship, and they still managed to attack it. So the and of course, it's having an effect on the Israeli economy. People talk about the Egyptian, but it's also having an effect on the Israeli economy, right? Uh, uh, you know, if the Americans want this to stop, right? Like, it's either going to be carpet bomb them, and I think optically they don't want to be there because everybody understands how simple this is, right? Like, Israel stops bombing Gaza. They've killed over 25,000 people. There's the ICJ that, essentially, I think the ICJ is misunderstood. Um, it's in The Hague. It's part of the UN system. It's not the ICC. Uh, but basically, the ruling was 15-2, and they used the statements that Netanyahu made, like, we're going to, kill Amalek. We're going to destroy Amalek. Some rabbis think Germans are Amalek. Oh, in fact, all Europeans are also Amalek. But this time he meant like the
Yeah,
Edomite
the
Alameks.
Armenians were Amalek back in the 11th century. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
this really shows what the Old Testament becomes outside of the light of the New Testament, and it devolves
Yeah,
exactly into this.
right. So um, it's very simple, right? If basically what they've said is if Israel does, like, in a month, there will be a review, and that review will determine whether Israel is actually committing a genocide, right? They're hinting that there's potentially that is what's happening. Now, if they said right at the beginning that if they issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu, some of his cabinet members, the same cabinet members who said, starve them. Of course, there are Israelis that are stopping for 4 days now, stopping aid from getting in. These are just stupid Israeli Jews with their Israeli flag trying to literally starve these people. Like, these are absolute pieces of shit. I don't even know why people live in Israel. So, um, anyways, it's very simple, right? The attacks from the Houthis stop if you can get Israel to stop what they're doing. If Israel doesn't stop what they're doing, and they're saying that they're going to involve themselves in a larger war with Lebanon, it may be that they'll, I don't know. I mean, the Americans don't expect them to stop. The Americans just expect them to bomb less. But of course, for the Americans to solve the issue with the Houthis, they're going to have to send in forces into Yemen. And now with the death of the, and of course the neocons, of course, have said no, you cannot leave Iraq, you cannot leave Syria. And then what do you have right afterwards? Well, you have um, the attack on this American base that kills uh, three soldiers. One is a young woman, the other one is a middle-aged man, and another one is a young man. I mean, they're young, they're in their early 20s, mid 20s. So um, it's
I know
funny
it
how
might
that
sound
happened.
a
It's
bit
funny how that,
outlandish, but we have to question: were these real people, or are they just saying that there were three casualties?
yeah, I mean, maybe they're real, but like, I don't know, like, it's the timing couldn't be better, right? Like, um, the neocons are saying you are not leaving Syria and you are not leaving Iraq. You know, the presumption is, of course, Israel is going to need help in Lebanon, and something has to be done about the Houthis. So that's where America's attention will go, and therefore, it's time to leave Iraq and it's time to leave Syria. And of course, they're being pulled now, saying, "Well, you're going to abandon these, you know, your bases in Syria after they killed three of your men. How will that look?" So America's it, it it's getting stretched. You know, I don't know what they're going to do about it. If they start acting like Israel, well then I don't know. It's really kind of over. Um,
Do you think they have a sweetheart deal for China up their sleeve that could alleviate the tensions there? I don't.
yeah, I'm not sure they do.
Because I
Um,
think that's the only viable solution is that they have some ace up their sleeve or are
yeah.
willing to, approach some sort of détente with Russia, which I think that they've clearly demonstrated at this point they are not willing to. And that in terms of any sort
Mm-mm.
of reconciliation, despite the saber rattling over the past several years, realistically, I see the Chinese and the East Asian theater the only place where that can happen. And I'm not saying they want that to happen, but even if they did, they have no bargaining power. They have nothing to offer. And I suppose the next best thing they could do is find some way to sabotage the peace agreements between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which I once again really don't know what they can do. What can they offer Saudi Arabia? What can they offer Iran? And I need to really say the funniest part of all of this. Now, I'm not saying it would have completely prevented all of this, but it certainly
They've
would have.
joined BRICS, both of them.
Yeah, they've joined BRICS. Now, this certainly wouldn't. I can't say whether it would have prevented all of this, but it certainly did change the course and the direction at which everything was going, and of course the intensity. Is tearing up the Iran deal may have been the best thing that ever happened for Saudi Iranian relations in terms of Chinese influence. The fact that Trump just went full balls to the wall and said, "No, we're standing with Israel. We're tearing up that deal, and we're gonna, stand against the Iranians, and then only for Biden to come into office and for all this to happen." Once again, that might have been the biggest, I guess, say blessing in disguise as far as the Iranians are concerned when it comes to their position in the region and in the world is watching this deal fall apart. And I don't know, perhaps I don't want to give the Obama administration or Brzezinski too much credit, but perhaps the JCPOA was the move at the time that needed to be done in order to maintain American power in the region. I do think, in retrospect, that it probably was.
Yeah, it was. It was actually, it was. Obama was literally right about this, and Trump was an idiot. Of course, he followed Israel too much, and you know, what is he going to do now?
I'm an Iran deal accelerationist. I think
But
that it
um,
turned out for the best.
I mean, the best option America has in this, you know, event where it's being really stretched is they have to hit Iran so hard that it, um, I don't know, that means the Houthis are terrified, Hezbollah in Lebanon is terrified, the Syrians don't do anything, the Iraqi resistance forces don't do like that's what it would take because if they fight them individually with a land army, like they're just going to get bogged down again, right?
I mean,
And
truthfully, and once again, I'm not
of
endorsing this
course,
by any
no matter
means.
course of action, they where does that leave Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely. Um, But I think it would be a radical move. It would be a drastic move. But the only strike I think that could accomplish America's goal in this case is if they just hit Iranian nuclear plants and Iranian enrichment plants. And once again, that'll also drive home the point about the Iranian bomb program, all of that. But I think in terms of just size of
Like so many
strike,
of these facilities are underground now, and
yeah. And like I
if
said,
they
I'm
hit
not even
the
saying
oil
it's feasible,
wells,
but
they can be repaired.
yeah, I'm not like I said, I'm not even saying it's feasible. But theoretically, I think the only thing they could do is some sort of strike against the uh, Iranian nuclear infrastructure, and because in terms of
Hmm.
I mean, unless they're just going to terror bomb Tehran and just unload on the entire city and just carpet bomb them, which, like I said, I that would also be a major escalation. There's not everything they do is going to have a. I mean, of course, everything always has consequences, but everything they do is going to have a consequence that they simply cannot bear. And what are they going to wage a sustained campaign against the Iranian infrastructure programs, against Iranian industry? I don't know. Maybe they hit some of these Shahed factories that, from once again, who knows? But I guess try to stir up internal strife again, ethnic separatism, women's rights, human rights. But once again, we've seen that time
Yeah.
again. Those never come to fruition. People always end up returning to the status quo, and that the regime, while not the most popular, is still popular enough to maintain legitimacy. And like I said, it is a, and perhaps it's because I'm no grand strategist, but America, over the course of the past decade at least, probably going back further, if we're being honest, has burned every bridge it had. Whether that be in terms of a neoconservative direction, whether that be in
Mhm.
terms of a more, let's just say, skeptical foreign intervention nationalist perspective. That's certainly not getting off the ground. Whether it be from the liberal internationalist perspective, all of these bridges have been burned. And you can bring in the next Kissinger. I mean, they had Kissinger himself for years, and they still couldn't fix his bind. But they could bring in the greatest foreign policy minds, and beyond taking a major humiliation, which would certainly, if we are not already, put us in a world with multiple great powers, there is no sustainable option going forward. There is no reshuffling of the deck where America comes out on top of this. And how they can bring Trump back, there's no realistic option because everything they could do that would sufficiently show their force is almost guaranteed to lead to some sort of cataclysmic escalation at this point. There's nothing they can do, and like I said,
Hmm.
while I'm no supporter of the American empire,
Yeah,
you do have to
you
be
get
worried about the volatility of the situation and how quickly things can spiral out of control.
right. You have to think. Are we nearing that time? Because the Houthis right now, they've killed no one. They're. I think they're intentionally just wanting to damage these ships. All they have to do is freeze traffic in the Red Sea and force everyone to go all the way around
Yeah, they just need
Africa.
to make it a liability for the insurance companies. That's all they need to do.
That's it. That's all that needs to be done. And now we've seen like even secret attempts, as it were, to I know they're not that secret, but no one was expecting that another Maersk owned ship would get hit. Um, of course, Russian and Chinese ships are exempt from this; they're free to move, right? Which speaks volumes. But if it escalated, I imagine the Houthis have other armaments and attack systems that would eventually sink a ship, right? Now the Americans are denying, but one of their ships was apparently hit. I don't know. You have two sides, one claiming yes, the other one no. Um, I mean, America needs a lot more troops. When they went into Iraq the second time, they had over 400,000 troops. Um,
And that was American forces alone, not even
I
including the
just think
coalition forces.
they need at least that, if not more. What was that?
And that was just American numbers alone, not including the quote unquote coalition of the willing and the men that the British and
Yeah,
the
yeah. That
Australians,
was another
etc.
100,000 on top of that.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, who are they going to convince them? They'll need at least 500,000 men at arms to march in Tehran, on top of whatever else they could draw from NATO. And
They're never going to go like they're never going to invade Iran. But that's just not going to
no,
happen.
it's not.
It's just not. Some precision strikes, yes, that's there to convince them, but I don't know. I think the Iranians are ready. I'm sure there's a neocon calculus that is saying if we strike them really bad, maybe that'll cause protests. Maybe that'll oust the Ayatollahs. I think that's one calculus that they're formulating right now. But I don't know. Like I mean, it would be an effort if they went into Yemen. Like, let's be honest.
The military infrastructure is simply not there, and
Yeah.
it's something that they would have to support from across the ocean. Because keep in mind, after the Cold War, especially in Europe, we dismantled the local supply chains that we had in case of a war. The way
Hmm.
that we fought the Gulf War in such a lopsided way is because in the Middle East we had that military infrastructure set up in case of a war in that region. And when that war in the region that did break out, it was no contest. We've dismantled that. We've burned bridges with the Gulf states. We've soured our relations with every power player in the region, particularly thanks to Israel. And I look at our post 9/11 foreign policy, any sort of pragmatism in the Middle East went out the window. At this point, sure, the Egyptians are still receiving billions in aid from the United States, and they still do maintain diplomatic relations with us. But if we were to lean on the Egyptians for any major demands, are they going to cooperate? No, absolutely not. That's not going to happen.
Hmm.
Uh, Iraq
Yeah,
is
and
completely
especially
crushed.
right. And you brought up funding for Egypt, CJ. And before anybody like if you're a long time listener, don't worry. I know the ICJ is whatever. It's still part of global homo. I get it. I just don't care. Okay, I understand.
No,
But that's the fate of the
I
West.
love it when they eat each
Okay,
other.
yeah, that's the fate of the West. You're stuck with it. Um, but what I'm saying about that ruling, and I just don't care. I like any ruling against Israel is fine by me. Like they pulled funding, Britain, Italy, Canada, the U.S., France might be another one. But all of these countries have funding for the Palestinians in Israel and in Palestine, right? So the UNRWA. Now, the reason they did it right after the ruling, and people said, oh, this is a toothless ruling. No, basically, in a month, they're going to review what Israel has done to curb the potential genocide, right? If they don't, then they will declare it a genocide. And then it could go to the ICC or they'll issue warrants. And you say, well, none of those are enforceable. Yeah, but America relies on this stuff. Western powers rely on these notions. Okay, that's how they project power.
Yes,
And
this is how we've nailed every
like I
Middle
say,
Eastern
the
and
court
African dictator that
itself
we've
is
wanted to take
under.
down.
What's that?
This is how we've nailed every Middle Eastern and African dictator that we've targeted for the past 30 years.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, this is not a court, of course, the U.S. belongs to because it would be convicted of war crimes. But the thing is, um, um, it relies on it. I mean, so we're not going to chase monsters across the world. Um, the European colonialist powers. I mean, of course, America's always had a disdain for the colonial powers. It said that they will destroy themselves. I mean, not without the effort of the U.S. in some circumstances, but I mean, the U.S. Its hubris comes from creating a better colonialism. right? It can't stand these other, colonies because in many ways, America is part of like the last stage or the latter stages of Western civilization. And so it's not built on, king and country and or God and country with the king, right? That structure is gone, and so it doesn't hate them for the reasons you think it hates them. It doesn't think they're obsolete for the reasons you might think they're obsolete, right? So I'm just saying this is like these courts, whatever you might think of them, for them are like literally it's the equivalent of the Pope voting, making a statement about something 450 years ago, and you're France or Portugal, another country, right? Or even before the Reformation. Uh, so that's a symbolic power that they have, right? But people can see that even these institutions, they're getting long in the tooth. People don't really believe in them, but they're how can I put it? They play a very important role for America's soft power. America really, really relies on soft power. The part of the reason they laugh at the old colonial powers is they knew that they had. This is what I meant about latter stages. They knew that how they foresee society going is how society rightly goes. That's why America says that we stand taller than anybody else and can see the future better than anybody else, right? It's a feedback loop, right? They create the future, they see the future better because they also partly understand the collapse of the West, the collapse of church, the collapse of monarchy. That's what they're talking about. And so that's why these courts are very important. So people scoff at them for all the wrong reasons. Anyhow,
I think that you summed it up that these institutions, while of course the Americans don't belong to them, that they outsource their moral haranguing to them, and as you said, they do
yes,
carry quasi-religious authority. The fact
yeah,
that they have turned inward and that they have turned cannibalistic, it does show that
yeah.
it
Why
marks.
is a Jewish Russian guy running to be president of Russia
Yeah, that's,
during an existential battle? And he says, "Oh, but if not, I'm not just going to stop the SMO. I'm going to bring LGBTQ rights." Like, why would he say that? Right? Because
yes,
that's the message.
yeah.
Because that's the gospel of America.
It's no, like I said, there's nothing I can really add to that, and it's a situation where because there are no visible winning moves, I do fear the drastic, and I hope
Oh,
I'm
that
wrong.
me too.
I
Me
hope
too.
I'm wrong about that, but if it were the time where America does do something off the rails, like launching a nuke, it would be now. It would be this moment. It would be this year, especially heading
And it
into.
would be a country that could not retaliate, and the countries that could retaliate would have to think really hard about doing it.
Yeah, I mean,
And it would have to be symbolic. It would have to be like, so far, I think the death of 3 soldiers is not enough.
oh no, no, not.
It's not a big. This is an insurgent army that did this. America's lost soldiers, private contractors before in Iraq or wherever. Who cares? Big deal. They're in Jordan. So what?
Like I said, they'd have to hit
Um,
like one of the major military infrastructures, for example, that we have like in Kuwait or Qatar. I think would warrant
mhm,
that kind of response.
mhm.
From what I've seen it as, but it's where we're at, and um, I hope I'm wrong about a lot of what I say on the show. I never go into this looking for any sort of
Yeah, me too.
any sort of escalation. I mean, like, yeah, haha, accelerationism, but there's real consequence to those sort of things, and I
Yeah.
don't think. were going to come out for the better for them. Now, I do think there are necessary changes that need to be made. I do think that there's a reshuffling that needs to take place. And while I do acknowledge that and its inevitability and perhaps even some good that may come out of it, I also acknowledge that the current structures are not going to go down without a fight, and that they have the potential to make this apocalyptic, frankly, for all of us across the world. And look, I hope there's some sort of bloodless coup, so to speak, of the world order that negates that possibility. But I have my severe doubts in the fact that they're talking about
Hmm.
war by 2030. I mean, I just don't know. You would need some sort of major political crisis, some sort of major legitimacy crisis within the United States in order to negate that. But once again, you also run the risk as legitimacy slips, so aggression increases in order to make up for that lost legitimacy, and it becomes a vicious cycle that feeds into it. Where uh, keep in mind this is the first. Now, I suppose you can count the fall of the Soviet Union as a precursor to this, but this is the first real realignment of the global order we've had in the nuclear age. We've never had the
Hmm.
capabilities that we've had before when it comes to destruction and loss of human life. And so we're in completely uncharted territories as far as that's concerned. And I really hate to see what that might turn out to be. Now, like I said, hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully there are more rational actors, more cooler heads do prevail on such issues, but I'm not seeing them. And I wish I was. Like I said, I don't take pleasure in saying any of this. This isn't a wish list by any means, but I think these are all things that we need to be aware of. And I guess that's really all I had to say about all of this, I suppose.
Yeah, uh, me too. I think, yeah, I think we've covered most of the topics that we wanted to tonight.
Well, we've returned to the foreboding endings. I apologize for those of you who might not enjoy that. But I do think that that is par for the course in the program. I don't know. Hopefully, I don't know. Things might get bad, but hopefully they get funny too. And I suppose they are. But I'm just
It's an
saying
election year.
that the crisis to entertainment ratio, as far as I'm concerned, it has been way down in the past couple of years. Whereas a few years ago, and I would say 2020 was actually the cutoff for that. The crisis to entertainment ratio, and you know what? I give full credit to Donald Trump for that, and I hope he can deliver on the second time around. But I also have my skepticism about that as well. But that's all we had for this week. So I suppose we'll see you guys
Yeah.
next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.